Hey, guys. Dim the lights, turn on a fan for some soft white noise, and join us as we gently unfold the life, loves, and legacies of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth Tudor. The year was 1533, and the air in Greenwich Palace buzzed with anxious expectation. King Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir, awaited the arrival of his second child. His new wife and bullet had captivated England, clever, ambitious, and defiant. But when the midwives delivered a baby girl on September 7th, silence fell over the court. The longed-for son had not arrived. Instead, a daughter, Elizabeth. Her birth was not celebrated with the grandeur of a future queen. It was, to many, a political failure. But to her mother and to a few loyal supporters, Elizabeth was precious. The infant princess had fiery red hair and a sharp, curious gaze. She bore her father's Tudor blood and her mother's bold spirit. What no one yet realized was that this small child was born into disappointment, would one day command an empire. Elizabeth's early years were not easy. When she was not yet 3, her world turned dark. Her mother, once queen, was arrested, accused of adultery and treason, and taken to the Tower of London. Days later, Boleyn was executed, beheaded by sword. Elizabeth, now the daughter of a disgraced woman, was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title. The royal cradle was replaced by a quiet life in the countryside. She was watched more than she was loved, moved between households. Her royal blood kept her in privilege, but her mother's fall kept her in danger. Her father, Henry VIII, married again and again, and Elizabeth watched, silent and observant, as wives were crowned, discarded, or destroyed. But Elizabeth did not fade. She listened. She learned. Her education was entrusted to the finest scholars, and she absorbed Latin, French, and philosophy with astonishing speed. She read of empires, saints, and kings. Even in childhood, she showed signs of something rare, resilience wrapped in intelligence. Though she had been born into scandal and loss, Elizabeth began to shape herself into something greater, not just a survivor of her mother's tragedy, but a student of it. She understood what power could do, what love could cost, what silence could protect. And deep inside, the fire of her future reign quietly began to burn. As Elizabeth grew into a young girl, her world remained unpredictable, shaped by the whims of a volatile court and the ever-changing moods of a father she barely knew. But even in this world of danger, she learned to adapt, not by force, but by watching, listening, waiting. While others fought for position, Elizabeth became a master of stillness. She paid attention to how words were used as weapons, how smiles could hide betrayal. Her mind became her fortress, and inside it she stored every lesson. Her education continued to flourish. Elizabeth read the works of Cicero and Seneca, absorbing the logic of ancient Rome and the grace of classical poetry. She wrote letters in Latin, translated Greek texts, and spoke French and Italian with near-perfect fluency. More than just a noblewoman in waiting, she was becoming one of the most intellectually gifted women in Europe. But knowledge alone couldn't protect her. When her half-brother Edward ascended the throne, Elizabeth kept her head low. And when her half-sister Mary, fiercely Catholic and suspicious of all Protestants, became queen, Elizabeth's life entered a new phase of danger. Whispers surrounded her. Some believed she conspired with Protestant rebels. Others thought she secretly wished to take the throne. In 1554, when a rebellion erupted against Queen Mary, Elizabeth was implicated. She was taken to the Tower of London. The same stone walls that had once held her mother now closed around her. For weeks, she lived with the fear that she might never leave alive. The cold halls of the tower echoed with silence, interrupted only by the creak of footsteps, the distant sound of ravens, and her own quiet prayers. But still, she did not break. Elizabeth denied every accusation with measured clarity. She wrote carefully worded letters to the Queen, denying treason while never seeming too confident. She cried when needed, stayed calm when expected, and allowed her silence to speak louder than outrage ever could. Eventually, she was released, but not because she believed. She had simply become too dangerous to kill and too careful to condemn. When she walked out of the tower, Elizabeth was no longer just a princess with a claim. She was a woman forged in suspicion, sharpened by survival, and her time was coming. The year was 1558, and the bells of London rang for the death of Queen Mary. The land was quiet with anticipation. After decades of religious strife, burnings, executions, and unrest, the people looked to a new sovereign. A woman once imprisoned in the Tower, once branded illegitimate, was now to wear the crown. Elizabeth Tudor, just 25 years old, was proclaimed Queen of England. She rode through the capital streets on a white horse, the November air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and change. The people cheered. Tossing their caps and kneeling in muddy streets, she smiled, radiant and composed, but inside she knew the weight she now bore. England was divided. The treasury was nearly bankrupt. Foreign enemies circled, and many still doubted that a woman could rule alone. But Elizabeth had prepared for this moment her entire life. Her coronation on January 15, 1559, was a pageant of gold, velvet, and incense. She walked into Westminster Abbey, dressed in white and crimson, crowned beneath the ancient arches of kings. And yet there was something different in her reign from the very start. A sense of resolve, of clarity, of control. One of her first decisions was to restore the Church of England, breaking once more from Rome. But she did it with care. She did not launch mass persecutions or inflame tensions instead. She sought compromise. She wanted peace, not fanaticism. She assembled a council of trusted advisors. William Cecil became her most loyal servant, brilliant, steady, and wise. Others, like Francis Walsingham and Nicholas Bacon, formed the backbone of her government. These men understood her vision, a stable England ruled not by fear, but by intelligence and restraint. And then there was the question that would never go away. Marriage. Parliament urged her to choose a husband. Foreign courts sent proposals. Princes and dukes were presented like rare gifts. But Elizabeth refused. Not rudely, not hastily. She simply never said yes. She once told her advisors, "I'm already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." She would rule alone. In a world where women were expected to follow, Elizabeth had chosen to lead. And though the road ahead would be lined with enemies, threats, and heartbreak, she had already made the most important decision of her reign. She would never share the crown. From the moment she wore the crown, Elizabeth became the most sought-after bride in Europe. Not for love, but for alliance, control, and power. Kings and princes, dukes and noblemen lined up to win her hand. Each proposal carried with it the weight of diplomacy. A marriage to Elizabeth could shift the balance of Europe, but she remained unmarried. One name rose above the rest. Robert Dudley, handsome, charming, and ever-present at Elizabeth's side. They had known each other since childhood. He was one of the few who could make her laugh. Whispers at court speculated endlessly about the nature of their bond. His wife's sudden and suspicious death only deepened the rumors. And yet Elizabeth did not marry him. She did not marry anyone. There were many suitors over the years. Philip II of Spain, once married to her sister Mary, the Archduke Charles of Austria, Francis, Duke of Anjou. Each man represented a possible alliance. Each courtship was drawn out, sometimes for years, only to end in diplomatic silence. Elizabeth played the game carefully. She used the promise of marriage as a diplomatic tool, never rejecting outright, never surrendering control. She kept foreign rulers hopeful while keeping their ambitions at bay. It was a delicate balance, and she mastered it. At home, her choice not to marry made her a curiosity, even a source of anxiety, a queen without a king, a woman ruling alone, and above all, a woman without an heir. Still, she crafted a new identity, the Virgin Queen. She transformed what others saw as a weakness into a symbol of divine purpose. Paintings began to depict her not just as a monarch, but as a myth, draped in pearls, bathed in light, untouched by earthly concerns. She belonged not to any man, but to England. In truth, the choice was both personal and political. Elizabeth had seen too clearly what marriage could cost. How could weaken a queen, make her vulnerable, or worse, allow another to rule in her name? She valued her sovereignty too much, so she walked alone. And with every year, that decision echoed more powerfully. Elizabeth was not just England's ruler. She was its bride as Elizabeth's reign deepened. Her court blossomed into something extraordinary. More than a seat of governance, it became a stage where wit, poetry, art, and ambition all danced beneath the Queen's gaze. It was a theater of power, and Elizabeth was its leading lady. The court at Whitehall and Richmond glittered with silk and gold. Courtiers arrived dressed in the latest fashions, ruffled collars, jeweled sleeves, and velvet robes. Yet beneath the shimmer, a quiet competition brewed. Every look, every gesture, every carefully chosen word was a move in a larger game to win the Queen's favor. Elizabeth encouraged it. She loved spectacle. Masks, dances, and elaborate entertainments filled the royal calendar. Poets like Edmund Spenser wrote verses in her honor. Painters immortalized her in portraits as mythic and ageless with symbolic pearls, celestial globes, and serene expressions. These were not just flattery. They were propaganda, carefully crafted to reinforce her power. And then, of course, there was William Shakespeare. Though he never performed directly for Elizabeth in his early years, his work rose alongside the golden age she nurtured. His plays explored ambition, betrayal, love, and fate, themes she knew all too well. But court life was not all elegance and artistry. It was also dangerous. Beneath the surface, rivalries brewed, factions formed, spies listened. Elizabeth maintained control with remarkable finesse. She never married, yet she played favorites, raising men like Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, and the Earl of Essex to great heights, only to cast them down when they overreached. Still, she rewarded loyalty and brilliance. Her closest advisors remained constant, especially William Cecil, her backbone in policy and planning. With his help, she maintained a delicate balance, allowing just enough freedom to keep the court vibrant, but never enough to threaten her throne. Though the pressures of rule were immense, Elizabeth rarely showed weakness. Even as the years passed, she wore the mask of magnificence. Her makeup grew heavier. Her hair was more elaborate, but it was all part of the performance. She was creating an image, one that would outlast her. To her people, the court was a mirror of her rule, majestic, intelligent, and fiercely controlled. And at its center stood a queen who understood better than anyone that power wasn't just taken, it was performed. Though Elizabeth's court dazzled with poetry and splendor, shadows gathered beyond the palace walls. Her reign was marked not only by brilliance, but by constant threats, some born from ambition, others from blood. Among the most dangerous of these was her own cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was everything Elizabeth was not: Catholic, widowed young, and a former queen consort of France. To many English Catholics, Mary had the stronger claim to the English throne. She was seen not just as an alternative, but as the rightful queen. And worse still, she was living under Elizabeth's watchful eye. After being forced to abdicate her Scottish throne, Mary fled to England in 1568, expecting Elizabeth's protection. What she found instead was elegant imprisonment. She was moved from castle to castle, closely guarded, politely confined for nearly 19 years. Mary was a guest in a gilded cage, but she was never harmless. Plots formed around her. Letters were smuggled. Conspirators whispered her name in darkened halls. Some wanted to kill Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Time and again, Elizabeth hesitated. Mary was, after all, royalty, fellow queen, and Elizabeth believed deeply in the divine right of monarchs. How could she justify executing one of her own? And yet the plots kept coming. Finally, one went too far. In 1586, the Babington plot was uncovered, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. This time, the evidence was undeniable. Mary's own letters were discovered, proving her involvement. Elizabeth wrestled with the decision. She signed the death warrant, then paused, then signed again. On February 8, 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. The moment was solemn. Mary wore red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. When the axe fell, Europe was horrified. Elizabeth herself retreated into days of silence. She claimed the execution was done without her final consent, but the deed was done. The Queen had destroyed her greatest rival. It was a turning point. Not just politically, but emotionally. From that moment forward, Elizabeth became more isolated. She trusted fewer people. Her decisions carried more weight. She knew now, in the most painful way, that being queen meant carrying both the crown and the consequences. She had survived rebellion, but it cost her a piece of her soul. The year was 1588, and a storm was coming, not from the skies, but from across the sea. For decades, tension had simmered between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. At last, the conflict erupted into the most iconic military crisis of Elizabeth's reign, the Spanish Armada. Spain, led by King Philip II, had once been Elizabeth's suitor. Now he was her enemy, outraged by Mary, Queen of Scots' execution, and angered by English raids on Spanish ships. Philip launched a grand invasion. Over 130 ships carrying more than 30,000 men set sail for England. It was called the Invincible Armada. England was outmatched. Fewer ships, fewer men, less firepower. But Elizabeth had something Spain didn't: speed, strategy, and unshakable resolve. As the Armada approached, Elizabeth traveled to Tilbury, where English troops awaited, clad in armor. Beneath a silver breastplate, she delivered a speech that would become legend. "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Her words stirred the soldiers, but the battle would be fought at sea. English ships, smaller and faster, harassed the Spanish formation in a narrow channel. Fireships scattered the fleet at Calais, and then nature intervened. Terrible storms battered the Spanish as they tried to flee in around Scotland and Ireland. Many ships were wrecked. Thousands of men were lost. When it was over, only half of the Armada returned to Spain. The invasion had failed. Elizabeth had survived. But the victory was not just military, it was symbolic. England, small and divided only a generation before, had stood against the most powerful empire in the world and endured. Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen became more powerful than ever. She was no longer just a monarch. She was a national icon. Paintings showed her standing tall with her hand over the globe, her gown studded with eyes and ears, symbolizing her awareness, her command. The moment solidified her legacy. The defeat of the Armada didn't end all threats, but it marked a turning point. Elizabeth's England would never be underestimated again, and the Queen, once doubted by kings and dismissed as a woman alone, had now proven herself invincible. In the years that followed the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Queen Elizabeth I stood at the height of her power. Her face adorned medals, coins, and tapestries. Foreign ambassadors bowed with reverence. Her people praised her as Gloriana, the shining jewel of England. But time, like the tide, could not be held back. The Queen, who once dazzled with youth and wit, now entered her 50s and 60s. Her most trusted counselors began to die. William Cecil, her wise and faithful advisor for 4 decades, passed away. Robert Dudley, perhaps the only man she ever loved, died unexpectedly in 1588. When she heard the news, she locked herself in her chambers and refused to eat for days. The court grew colder. New courtiers sought power, but few earned her trust. She grew more suspicious, more reserved. Her days were filled with ceremony and statecraft, but her nights increasingly with silence. One of her last favorites, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, embodied the trouble of this fading era. Young, charming, and ambitious, Essex captured Elizabeth's favor, but also her ire. He disobeyed orders, failed in battle, and eventually led a reckless rebellion against the crown in 1601. Elizabeth was forced to sign his death warrant. He was executed for treason, and with him another piece of her heart vanished. Economically, the country strained. War had emptied the treasury. The cost of living rose. The once glittering court became more ceremonial, less vibrant. Yet the people still loved her. They saw in Elizabeth not just a queen, but the spirit of their nation, enduring, proud, and unyielding. In her final years, Elizabeth refused to name a successor, fearful that it would undermine her authority while she still lived. She stood alone, increasingly weary, yet unwilling to let go of power. The once glorious pageants grew fewer. The dances slowed, the sparkle dimmed, but the crown remained firmly on her head. She wore white lead makeup to mask the aging face beneath. Her hair, once auburn, was now a wig, but she still stood tall in her towering gowns, her voice commanding even when her strength waned. In her twilight, she clung to one thing above all else: her image, because she knew long before others did that her legend would outlive her. By the dawn of 1603, Queen Elizabeth III was a woman at the end of a long and extraordinary journey. She had ruled England for 44 years, guiding it through rebellion, invasion, plague, and Renaissance. But now, at age 69, she was tired. She withdrew more often from public life. Her appetite faded. She grew thinner, more distant, sometimes lost in thought for hours, sitting silently beneath the windows of Richmond Palace. Those closest to her knew the Queen was slipping away. She refused to take to her bed. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was fear of the symbolism. A monarch lying down meant a monarch nearing death. She stood or sat on cushions on the floor for hours, dressed in white, cloaked in silence. When her doctors pressed her to rest, she replied softly, "Must is not a word to be used to princes." In her final days, Elizabeth reportedly pointed to the name of James Sussex of Scotland as her successor, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. It was a full circle of fate. The woman she had once executed would now have a son inherit her throne, but there was no bitterness in it, only inevitability. On March 24, 1603, the Virgin Queen passed away in her sleep. The news echoed through London. Bells rang, black cloth draped the streets, and her people mourned, not just the loss of a ruler, but the end of an age. The Tudor dynasty was over. Yet something remarkable happened. Elizabeth's legend did not fade. It grew. She was remembered not as a frail, an aging monarch, but as the radiant queen who had stood tall against empires, who gave her name to an era of discovery, drama, and defiance. She became myth. To this day, she remains one of the most admired women in history. The Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the mother of her people, who ruled alone and left behind a golden age. She was born in scandal, raised in fear, crowned in doubt. But the Queen of Legend died, and though her voice has long been silent, the echoes of her reign still shape the soul of a nation. England was her husband and history, her child. Long before the rise of modern hospitals, long before sterile tools and electric lights, the people of ancient Egypt practiced medicine in the warm, golden land along the Nile here. Beneath a sky of blazing sun and soft starlight, healing was both a sacred act and a daily necessity. The Egyptians believed that good health was a gift from the gods, and illness a sign of divine displeasure or spiritual imbalance. To be sick was not simply to be physically unwell. It was to be out of harmony with the world, the body, or the gods themselves. Health required balance, and so medicine was inseparable from religion, magic, and ritual. Healing began not with a diagnosis, but with a prayer. Temples were the first hospitals. Within their stone columns and perfumed air, priest-physicians listened to the cries of the ill, touched their foreheads, whispered incantations, and prepared herbal remedies with delicate care. The god Thoth, bringer of wisdom, and Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague and protection, were often called upon for healing. In many cases, medicine was not just applied, it was invoked. But the Egyptians were also practical. They observed wounds, cleaned them with wine or water from the Nile, and wrapped them with clean linen. They learned which herbs reduced fevers, which oils soothed the skin, and which minerals stopped bleeding. Their knowledge was passed down carefully, written in ink on fragile papyrus scrolls, guarded by temple scribes, and taught only to the trusted. They knew that certain diseases came with patterns, that childbirth required skill and cleanliness, that infection could be deadly, and that healing took both hands and words. To live in ancient Egypt was to live with death, always close. Crocodiles in the river, sandstorms in the desert, and disease in every corner. But it was also to live with beauty, rhythm, and care. People bathed daily. They used ointments to soften their skin, chewed herbs to freshen their breath, and honored their bodies as sacred vessels. Medicine in ancient Egypt was not just about survival. It was about preservation of health, of life, and eventually of the soul itself. In the land of the Nile, healing was both a science and a prayer whispered to eternity in the world of ancient Egypt. A healer was never simply a doctor. He was often a priest, a scholar, and a servant of the gods. Medicine was not merely learned, it was revealed through divine connection. And so the earliest physicians were temple-bound, guided by sacred texts and celestial forces. These physician priests were known as Sunu. They did not wear white coats, but linen robes. They carried not stethoscopes, but scrolls, amulets, and carved ritual tools. They served not only the sick, but the god who watched over the health of all. One such deity was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and sacred knowledge. He was believed to have gifted medicine to mankind, recording its principles in books locked deep within temple libraries. Thoth's presence was invoked whenever healing began, his name whispered before a word was spoken or a wound touched. But the most feared and revered goddess in this realm was Sekhmet. With the face of a lioness and eyes of fire, Sekhmet represented both disease and its cure. She was said to bring plagues upon Egypt when angered, but also to lift them when appeased. Prayers to Sekhmet were spoken with awe. Her priests memorized hundreds of rituals to calm her wrath and channel her healing strength. When a patient fell ill, Sunu consulted the gods through ritual. They would anoint sacred statues, burn incense, and chant over water to make it holy. Sometimes healing began with a dream. Patients slept inside temples, hoping the gods would reveal the cure while they rested in divine silence. Yet alongside the gods stood men like Imhotep, a real physician, architect, and sage who lived over 4,000 years ago, and was later worshipped as the god of medicine. Shrines were built in his name, and his wisdom was thought to protect against sickness even centuries after his death. This was the heart of Egyptian medicine, divine and practical, ancient and eternal. To treat the body, one had to honor the spirit. Healing required not just skill, but reverence. Every remedy was a ritual, every illness a message from the heavens. And the physician priest stood between two worlds, part healer, part messenger, forever listening to the breath of the gods. Deep within the storerooms of ancient temples, where the air was dry and the scent of incense lingered, scrolls were kept like treasure. Among them was one of the greatest artifacts of healing ever written, the Ebers Papyrus, discovered in the 19th century but penned over 3,500 years ago. This massive scroll stretched over 65 feet long. Written in careful hieratic script, it contained more than 700 remedies, spells, and surgical techniques. It was not just a medical manual. It was a living reflection of how the Egyptians viewed the body, disease, and the unseen forces that moved between them. The papyrus addressed nearly every part of the human form. There were treatments for eye infections and stomach pain, for broken bones and hair loss, for breathing troubles, and even mental disturbances. Some cures were purely herbal: cloves, honey, onions, and resins ground into pastes or steeped in wine. Others required chants or ritual gestures, calling on divine names to activate their power. One passage offered advice on treating asthma, a mixture of herbs heated on stones, with the patient instructed to inhale the rising vapors. Another described the symptoms of diabetes like conditions, frequent urination, and thirst, revealing an understanding of chronic illness far ahead of its time. And yet mixed among these observations were rituals, instructions to draw protective symbols on the skin, to recite words over amulets, or to bury certain materials beneath the moonlight. The Egyptians did not separate science from the sacred. To them, knowledge came from the gods, and healing required both the hand and the spirit. The Ebers Papyrus also spoke of the Mitu, a concept believed to be channels or vessels that carried air, blood, and other life forces throughout the body. Though not fully aligned with modern anatomy, it hinted at a deep curiosity about internal systems. The Egyptians may not have had microscopes, but they observed, they recorded, and they remembered. This ancient scroll was likely studied in temple schools, passed between physician priests, and consulted in times of illness or divine uncertainty. To touch its linen surface was to hold 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom, and within its fragile folds, the heartbeat of ancient Egyptian medicine still gently echoes. Though steeped in divine ritual and sacred chants, ancient Egyptian medicine was also remarkably hands-on. When wounds opened or bones snapped, when infections spread or childbirth grew perilous, there were no prayers that could replace the steady hand of a healer. Egyptian physicians understood the urgency of the body in crisis. They treated injuries with surprising precision, guided not only by the gods, but by experience, observation, and ingenuity. Their tools, made of bronze or obsidian, were simple but effective. Knives, hooks, clamps, and needles often clean with wine or fire to purify them before use. When a patient suffered a cut or gash, the physician would cleanse it with honey, a natural antiseptic rich in enzymes that killed bacteria. Then came linen bandages, carefully wrapped to protect the wound and promote healing. These were not the coarse strips used for mummies, but soft bleach cloth, sometimes infused with herbs or oils to soothe the skin. For broken bones, splints were carved from wood or reeds and tied securely with strips of fabric. Dislocated joints were massaged back into place with oils. Swelling was reduced using cool compresses made from crushed lotus root or ground minerals. Even burns were treated with mixtures of milk, honey, and clay to draw out heat and prevent infection. Surgeons understood the body's structure through animal dissection and battlefield necessity. Though internal surgery was rare, abscesses could be drained, boils lanced, and infected tissue removed. They even practiced a form of cauterization, using heat to stop bleeding or close wounds, sometimes with incantations spoken alongside, as if to seal the injury on both physical and spiritual levels. There was no anesthesia in the modern sense, but sedatives existed. Mandrake root, poppy extract, and fermented drinks could dull pain and ease the body into a dreamlike stillness. And through all of it, there was a sense of calm. The healer worked slowly, methodically. Each motion had meaning. Each patient was a soul in need of restoration, not just a body to be mended. In these moments, amid blood and bandages, the sacred met the practical. And through steady hands and ancient herbs, Egypt's sunlit temples gave birth to some of the world's first true surgeons. To walk into an ancient Egyptian healing chamber was to enter a space where the seen and the unseen coexisted. While herbs and salves were prepared by hand, just as vital were the words spoken, spells, incantations, and sacred names whispered into the air like medicine for the spirit. Illness was not always blamed on natural causes. Often it was believed that evil spirits, malevolent gods, or the restless dead had invaded the body. Cures had to be physical and spiritual. That meant using magic, not as superstition, but as a legitimate branch of medicine. A healer might begin by chanting over the patient, invoking protective deities like Isis, the nurturing mother goddess, or Bears, the dwarf god who warded off nightmares and disease. The rhythm of the chant was important. It had to flow like the Nile, smooth and uninterrupted. These incantations were thought to cleanse the air around the patient, drawing out invisible forces that caused pain or imbalance. In addition to words, amulets were essential tools of protection, worn around a neck, tied to the wrist, or hidden beneath wrappings. These charms were shaped with sacred intention. The scarab symbolized renewal and rebirth. The Eye of Horus protected against harm and ensured healing. An Ankh, the looped cross, offered vitality and long life. Each amulet was often made of specific materials: gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, believed to hold magical vibrations. They were blessed in temple rituals before being given to the sick. Some cures call for complex magical procedures. The spell might require the writing of a sacred name on a piece of papyrus, which would then be burned, buried, or swallowed with water. Other rituals involve drawing protective circles on the floor or painting symbols on the patient's skin to block evil forces from returning. Even medicines themselves were sometimes accompanied by spells. A poultice for a snake bite might be applied with the spoken words coming out poison. May I strike your heart. This union of word and substance, of spirit and science, formed the true heart of Egyptian healing. For them, the body could not be healed unless the soul was soothed, and so the healer became both doctor and sorcerer, treating the wounds that could be seen and casting out the ones that could not beneath the shadows of temple walls and along the fertile banks of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians gathered their medicine not from bottles, but from the earth, leaves, roots, resins, seeds, and flowers. Nature was their apothecary, and the land itself was filled with healing. The Egyptians knew their plants well. They understood which herbs cooled fevers, which eased pain, and which stirred the stomach into calm. Their remedies were not guessed. They were learned, passed from healer to apprentice, etched into papyri, and refined over generations. To soothe burns, they used aloe vera, its thick gel applied directly to damaged skin. For infections, they turned to myrrh, a fragrant resin harvested from desert trees. Myrrh was antibacterial, soothing, and sacred, burned in temples, rubbed into wounds, and mixed with wine for sore throats. Pain was relieved using willow bark, which contained salicin, an early version of aspirin. The bark was chewed or brewed into tea, its bitter taste masking the power within. Coriander, cumin, garlic, and juniper berries were used for digestion, while fenugreek calmed coughs and licorice roots sweetened the breath and soothed the throat. Many remedies were prepared with care. Ingredients were ground on smooth stone pallets, mixed with oil, wine, milk, or honey, and administered in carefully measured doses. Some were swallowed, others applied to the skin. Some were packed into wounds. Others were burned so the patient could inhale their healing smoke. Honey was a common ingredient, not just for taste, but for its natural ability to fight infection and preserve tissue. Milk and beer, sacred in daily life, became carriers for powder herbs or crushed minerals. Even animals played a role. Fat from crocodiles or hippos, crushed beetles or snakeskin might be used in rare treatments. Though always balanced by ritual and prayer, every ingredient had purpose, both physical and symbolic. Their medicine cabinets were not hidden behind glass. They grew from gardens, markets, and temple courtyards. The world itself was filled with healing if one knew where to look. And though their pharmacology was born from intuition rather than chemistry, the results spoke for themselves. For in ancient Egypt, plants were more than tools. They were silent physicians rooted in the rhythms of life. To the ancient Egyptian healer, diagnosing an illness was not a quick or simple task. The body, after all, was a vessel not only of blood and bone, but of spirit, emotion, and destiny. Understanding what ailed a person meant observing not just symptoms, but signs, not just the flesh, but the fate behind it. The physician-priest would begin by listening to the voice of the patient, the rhythm of their breath, the expression in their eyes. He might feel the pulse, not as we do today, counting beats, but sensing patterns of energy, tension, or imbalance in the flow of life through the body's hidden channels. They examined urine, sweat, and stools, looking for color, odor, or unusual texture. The tongue might be inspected as well as the skin, pale or flushed, hot or clammy, dry or slick with oil. But beyond these physical clues, a deeper question was always asked. Why now? Illness to them had cause, but it also had context. Was this punishment from a god, a curse from a jealous rival, an unseen spirit clinging to the soul? In more mysterious cases, healers turned to divination. They might consult the Book of Dreams, interpreting visions the patient had while sleeping. A dream of falling could mean a loss of protection. A dream of drowning might suggest the soul was overwhelmed. Temples even offered dream incubation chambers where the ill slept overnight, hoping to receive guidance from the gods themselves. Some healers drew sacred symbols in sand or cast small bones to read patterns. Others watched birds or consulted oracles, asking for signs from the divine. A diagnosis could come from the stars, from the flight of a hawk, or from the quiet hiss of wind through papyrus reeds. For those suffering mental distress, visions, confusion, or deep sorrow, the diagnosis might be spiritual possession, the cure. A blend of herbs, soothing words, and powerful incantations to banish the intruder from the mind. In Egypt, to diagnose was not only to name a disease, but to understand its story. Every illness had a beginning, a message, and if the gods willed it, a cure. And the healer's role was to uncover that hidden thread and gently bring it back into balance. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a continuation. A doorway, a sacred transition from one world to the next. And just as a physician healed the living, he also prepared the dead. The art of mummification was, in truth, a final act of medicine. The process was long 70 days of careful ritual preparation. It began with the washing of the body, using water from the Nile and fragrant palm wine to purify the flesh. Then came the removal of the internal organs, the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, each carefully taken and placed into canopic jars, watched over by protective gods. The heart, believed to house the soul and memory, was often left inside the body. In some cases, it was replaced by a sacred amulet, a scarab, to ensure safe passage through the afterlife. The most delicate step was the removal of the brain. A long hook tool was inserted through the nose, breaking the thin bone behind the eyes. The brain was drawn out in fragments not considered vital for the afterlife. Once emptied, the body was packed with natron salt, a powerful drying agent for 40 days. It rested in stillness as moisture left the flesh. Then came the wrapping, a process both medicinal and mystical. Hundreds of yards of linen were layered around the limbs, fingers, and torso, often inscribed with protective spells and sealed with resin. Amulets were placed between the layers, each symbol meant to guard a part of the spirit's journey: the Eye of Horus for protection, the Ankh for eternal life, the Jed pillar for strength and stability. The final wrapping was often done with great ceremony. Priests recited the opening of the mouth ritual, symbolically restoring the senses so the soul could eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. Perfumed oils were applied. A mask, often golden, was placed upon the face. The mummified body was then placed in a carved sarcophagus, and finally, within a tomb filled with food, tools, and text for the next world. For the Egyptians, to preserve the body was not vanity. It was love. It was the final healing, the eternal medicine, and through it, death itself was softened into sleep. Though the sands of long coveted temples and the papyrus scrolls have faded with time, the wisdom of Egypt's ancient healers still echoes in quiet ways. Their blend of science and spirit, of herbs and hymns, laid the foundation for generations to come, not only in medicine, but in how we understand the human experience of healing. Many of their practices traveled far. Greek scholars, including Hippocrates and Galen, studied Egyptian texts and techniques. The Greeks built upon Egyptian ideas of anatomy, diagnosis, and herbal remedies. Even the word pharmacy traces its roots to the Egyptian Perang, the house of life, where medicine, magic, and writing were preserved. Concepts like hygiene, wound care, and the importance of observation all find echoes in modern clinics. The ancient use of honey as an antiseptic, willow bark for pain, and garlic to strengthen the body are still supported by today's science. In some ways, the Nile's physicians were not primitive. They were pioneers, walking the line between the tangible and the divine. Yet their greatest legacy may not be found in ingredients or instruments, but in philosophy. They treated not just the body, but the soul. They listened not just to words, but to dreams. They understood that healing requires more than touch. It requires presence, stillness, intention. To them, illness was a message, a story to be unraveled, a sign of imbalance between the earth, the heavens, and the human heart. And healing was not just a cure, it was a return to harmony. In a world now ruled by machines and measurements, something of their ancient reverence still speaks. The quiet patience of the physician-priest, the soft chant over a cup of herbs, the belief that the act of healing in itself is sacred. Today we walk in the shadow of those sunlit halls, where stone lines once stood guard and incense drifted through columns. In the quiet corners of modern medicine, where a hand is held, a prayer is whispered, or a life is honored, we still feel the heartbeat of those who came before. The healers of the Nile have not been forgotten. They are still with us, in every breath that seeks to heal, and every soul that longs for peace. In the spring of 1945, Berlin was no longer the heart of an empire. It was a city in ruins. Bombed from the sky, battered by tanks and hollowed by years of war, the once proud capital of Nazi Germany was now a silent landscape of crumbling stone and broken windows. Streets were unrecognizable, landmarks reduced to rubble. The war had ended. But what followed was not peace. The victorious Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France met to decide the fate of Germany. Though enemies of the Nazis, they were not truly allies. Their ideologies had always stood in contrast. And now, as they stared across the same table, that contrast began to harden. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each governed by one of the Allies. Berlin, despite lying entirely within the Soviet zone, was also divided, a city within a country split among 4 foreign powers. What began as cooperation, an attempt to stabilize the nation, quickly shifted. Ideals clashed, agreements frayed. In the Western zones, the Americans, British, and French encouraged democratic rebuilding. They introduced free elections, supported private enterprise, and sought to revive Germany's economy. In the Eastern Zone, the Soviets imposed centralized control. They dismantled industry, censored opposition, and established the roots of a socialist state aligned with Moscow. Berlin became the epicenter of this growing rift. Once a single metropolis, it now hosted two opposing futures. West Berlin began to fill with American goods, jazz music, and newspapers. East Berlin echoed with propaganda, food rationing, and political purges. In these early post-war years, the border between East and West was not yet walled. People could still move freely between sectors, passing from one world to another by crossing a street. But tensions rose with each passing month. In 1948, when the Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Soviets retaliated with the Berlin blockade, sealing off road and rail access to the city. In response, the West launched the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation flying in food, fuel, and supplies. For nearly a year, West Berlin survived on wings. By the time the blockade ended, one thing was clear. Berlin was no longer just a city. It was a symbol, a fault line between freedom and control, between East and West, and it would only grow deeper. The end of the war had brought victory, but not unity. As months turned into years, the uneasy partnership between the Allies deteriorated into quiet hostility. The world was dividing, not just ideologically, but physically, and nowhere was that split more visible than in Berlin. The city that once stood as the cultural and political heart of Germany was now a microcosm of the entire Cold War. On one side, the Western Allies, led by the United States, pushed for reconstruction, democracy, and open markets. On the other, the Soviet Union moved swiftly to transform its sector into a socialist stronghold, aligning Berlin's East with Moscow's vision of the world. At first, the lines weren't drawn in concrete, but in policy. West Berlin flourished with American investment and consumer culture. Supermarkets, cars, and cinemas signaled a return to normalcy. East Berlin, however, became a city of ration cards. Gray buildings and propaganda posters promising equality through obedience. And the people noticed. Between 1949 and 1961, over 2.5 million East Germans fled to the West, many through Berlin. Teachers, engineers, doctors, and young professionals walked across the border, seeking opportunity and freedom. It was an exodus the East could not afford to sustain. As the escape numbers climbed, tensions reached a boiling point. The East German government, backed by the Soviets, accused the West of deliberately luring its citizens away. The West countered that people were simply choosing liberty. Each side pointed fingers. Each side fortified their stance. In the East, the Stasi, the secret police, grew in size and power, tasked with suppressing dissent and monitoring loyalty in the West. American troops remained stationed as both symbol and shield. Every bus that crossed sectors, every conversation overheard in a cafe, every glance at a foreign newspaper carried the weight of ideology. Berlin was no longer just divided. It was tense, fragile, and bracing for something more permanent. A wall didn't exist yet, but the idea of it had already taken root. The Iron Curtain was closing, brick by silent brick, and Berlin stood directly in its shadow. Soon that shadow would take form, and what had been imagined would become real. It happened without warning. In the still hours of the night, on August 13, 1961, we Berliners awoke to find their world changed. Soldiers, construction crews, and police moved silently under the cover of darkness, unrolling barbed wire and digging trenches. Roads were blocked. Train lines were cut. Families were divided in an instant. What had been an invisible border between East and West Berlin now had formed. It wasn't a wall. Not yet. It began as fencing, makeshift barricades, and rows of armed guards. But even in its earliest hours, it was unmistakably a prison. The East German government called it a protective barrier. They claimed it was necessary to defend socialism from Western aggression. In truth, it was built to stop the flow of people, to trap them within a regime that was hemorrhaging its citizens. Chaos followed. People raced to windows overlooking West Berlin, shouting to relatives they could no longer reach. Some tried to escape immediately, leaping from apartment buildings that bordered the dividing line, jumping into nets held by West Berlin firefighters. Others were pulled back by East German guards. A few were shot. Some fell to their deaths. Within days, concrete began replacing wire. Taller, stronger walls were poured and hardened. Streets that once flowed freely were now sealed by slabs of stone and guarded towers. Checkpoint Charlie, one of the few sanctioned crossings, became a tense standoff point where American and Soviet tanks would one day face each other, muzzle to muzzle. The wall grew quickly, 96 miles of separation, encircling Berlin like a noose. Watchtowers, searchlights, tripwires, and anti-vehicle trenches turned the border into a militarized zone. Anyone caught attempting to cross could be arrested, shot, or disappear entirely. It was more than a structure. It was a message, the message that freedom would now come at the cost of movement, choice, and reunion. Were no longer rights, but risks. For the people of Berlin, the wall was not just a border. It was a wound, raw, sudden, and unhealed. And though built overnight, its shadow would stretch across decades. After August 1961, Berlin was no longer one city. It was two lives, unfolding side by side, divided not only by concrete but by ideology, fear, and silence in West Berlin. Surrounded entirely by East German territory, life moved forward, free but encircled. The city became a showcase of Western democracy. Streets buzzed with cafes, bookstores, and universities. Western radio and television broadcast news, music, and culture. American troops patrolled visibly, a quiet guarantee of protection. Yet despite its freedom, Berlin remained an island, cut off, isolated, always aware of the wall just blocks away. For those living in East Berlin, life was more carefully controlled. The government promised safety, equality, and jobs for all. But behind that promise stood a powerful instrument of surveillance, the Stasi, East Germany's secret police. They listened, watched, and recorded. Nearly 1 in 6 East Germans became informants, sometimes willingly, often under pressure. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Teachers monitored students. Friends vanished after private conversations. A wrong word could mean arrest. A joke could end a career. And still, most people endured. They worked, raised families, went to concerts and museums, but always with a sense that someone was listening, that their lives were not entirely their own. The wall became part of the landscape. Children grew up playing in its shadow, never having known a time before it. Lovers stood on opposite sides, waving silently across the divide. Grandparents died without seeing their grandchildren again. Even telephone lines between East and West were severed. Letters were censored. Emotions had to be folded up like maps of a city you could no longer reach. And yet people adapted. West Berliners held protests and candlelight vigils. East Berliners found quiet joy where they could through music, poetry, whispered dreams. Churches became places of refuge where resistance could be spoken behind stained glass and candles. But no one ever forgot the wall. It was always there, gray, cold, and watching, a constant reminder that freedom could be taken in a night. And for the people of Berlin, life became a balancing act of hope and resignation, of love and loss, of waiting and remembering, waiting for the day the wall might fall. The Berlin Wall stood as a fortress, concrete, steel, and silence. But even the strongest walls could not stop the human desire for freedom. And so from the moment it rose, people began searching for ways to go over, under, and through. Some tried within hours. In those first confused days, people leapt from windows of buildings that bordered the West. Some made it. Others fell to their deaths as East German authorities rushed to brick up the exits. Over time, the escapes became more desperate and more daring. One group of friends spent months digging a tunnel beneath the wall, hauling dirt out in buckets and working by candlelight in the end. 29 people crawled to freedom through that narrow passage. Another family floated across the border in a homemade hot air balloon, stitched together from scraps of nylon and powered by propane tanks. Others hid in modified cars, curl beneath floorboards or crammed into secret compartments behind dashboards. A young man once drove full speed into a checkpoint with his windshield removed, so the border guards couldn't see him duck moments before he crossed. The gamble worked. He lived. Some tried to swim, the icy waters of canals and rivers offering a dangerous but open route. A few succeeded. Many did not. Bullets were often faster than water. In total, more than 5,000 people successfully escaped from East Berlin during the war years, but over 140 lost their lives in the attempt. Each one became a symbol of courage, desperation, and the cost of control. Among the most haunting was Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old shot while trying to climb over the wall in 1962. He fell back into the death strip, crying out for help as soldiers stood watching. No one came. He bled to death in view of the world. His story, and so many others, echoed beyond Berlin, stirring outrage and sorrow across the globe. For those who escaped, life in the West was often bittersweet. Freedom came with guilt, grief, and the knowledge that loved ones remained behind. But each successful crossing struck a quiet blow against the wall's power, because every escape was more than a journey. It was a reminder that no wall, no matter how high or guarded, could stop the will to be free. Not everyone could escape. For many in East Berlin, crossing the wall was never an option. Family, risk, or circumstance held them in place. But staying didn't mean surrendering. In the quiet corners of everyday life, resistance took root, not with weapons, but with words, whispers, and willpower. Writers and poets smuggled their work westward, publishing banned manuscripts under pen names. Their voices, too dangerous to speak aloud in East, were carried over the airwaves by Western radio. Even the act of listening became an act of rebellion, tuning into Radio Free Europe. Volume turned low. Curtains drawn shut. Churches became sanctuaries not just of worship, but of truth. While the state watched schools and workplaces, the Lutheran Church offered space for discussion, dissent, and hope. In candlelit halls, people gathered to talk about peace, reform, and the possibility of change. The regime tolerated the church only reluctantly, and its leaders became guardians of the last slivers of free thought. Artists turned blank walls into symbols. Painters created surreal, dreamlike pieces laced with meaning. Musicians recorded underground cassettes filled with lyrics that criticized the regime in metaphor. Even graffiti, dangerous and illegal, became a voice in the dark. Students passed notes in code. Families told jokes behind closed doors. Children grew up learning to speak in two ways, one for school, one for home. The Stasi watched it all. Their network was vast. Informants in universities, apartment buildings, theaters. A careless comment could result in interrogation or worse. Yet still, people resisted. Not loudly, not always visibly, but persistently. In West Berlin, solidarity movements rallied and amplified those voices. Activists sent books, letters, and support across the divide. Western musicians held concerts at the wall, their music spilling over the concrete. David Bowie in 1987 sang Heroes, just meters from East Berlin, his voice heard by thousands on both sides. Some resistance was dramatic, others quiet and slow burning. But each act, no matter how small, was a refusal to forget that freedom existed just beyond reach. The wall could divide a city, but it could not fully crush the human spirit. In silence, in song, in secret smiles, resistance endured, and beneath the surface of control, something was shifting. By the mid-1980s, change was stirring, not just in Berlin, but across the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union, long the architect of East Germany's policies, was beginning to shift under Mikhail Gorbachev, reforms known as glasnost openness. And perestroika restructuring began to ripple through the rigid steel of communist control. But East Germany's leadership resisted. Hardline and paranoid, they rejected reform, insisting that socialism would continue untouched. Yet the people knew otherwise. The outside world was no longer out of reach. Western television beamed images of prosperity. Radio waves carried voices of change. Travelers returned with stories of life beyond the wall. Then something unexpected happened. In Hungary, a fellow Eastern Bloc nation, border fences began to come down. In May 1989, Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a quiet escape route to the west. Thousands of East Germans poured into Hungary, then crossed into Austria and freedom. This wave of defiance sparked a chain reaction. Peaceful protests spread through East Germany. In Leipzig, citizens gathered in churches and public squares, holding candles and chanting where cinders spoke, "We are the people." Their message was clear. The government no longer spoke for them. Week after week, the protests grew in Dresden, Berlin, and other cities. Tens of thousands marched peacefully, but with conviction. For a state built on surveillance and silence, the noise of the people became deafening. International pressure mounted. Cameras captured the marches, the tension, the courage. Even East German security forces began to hesitate. The world was watching, and bloodshed would not go unnoticed. Behind closed doors, East German officials scrambled to respond. In their desperation to calm the protest, they made a mistake. A single sentence at a press conference delivered without clarity, suggesting that travel restrictions would be eased, effective immediately. The meaning was misunderstood. The people heard one thing: the border is open. That single crack, spoken in confusion, was enough. Crowds began to form at the checkpoints, demanding passage. The guards, stunned and uncertain, reached for phones that no one answered. And on that fragile, quiet confusion, a wall that had stood for 28 years began to tremble. It was the night of November 9th, 1989. Quiet and unremarkable at first, but by evening, something extraordinary began to unfold. Following the now infamous press conference blunder, where an East German official stated that citizens could cross the border immediately, thousands of East Berliners gathered at the wall. Confused, excited, skeptical, they came with passports, questions, and hope at the checkpoint. Bornholmerstrasse. The guards were overwhelmed. They hadn't received orders. No one knew what to do. Crowds grew. The chants became louder. "Open the gate." Some guards shouted into phones, asking for instructions, asking for help. But the higher-ups, too, were caught off guard. No orders came. And then, at 10:45 p.m., a miracle born of hesitation happened. A single border guard, faced with thousands of unrelenting citizens in no clear direction, made a choice. He opened the gate. Within moments, people surged forward, laughing, crying, embracing strangers. East Berliners poured into the west, where crowds were already waiting with champagne, flowers, and tears. The divide of decades was now a flood of joy as midnight approached. Berliners climbed the wall itself. They stood atop the concrete monster that had haunted them for 28 years, arms raised to the sky. Some chipped away at it with hammers and chisels, turning the wall into dust and souvenirs. Others simply sat in silence, unable to speak through the emotion. There was no violence, no sirens, no bullets, only freedom. The world watched in awe. News anchors struggled to hold back tears. Politicians scrambled to understand what was happening. But for the people of Berlin, there was nothing to debate. The wall had fallen, not by decree, not by policy, but by the will of those who refused to live divided. That night, the city sang. Streets once patrolled by soldiers rang with music, clinking glasses, and the murmur of reunions. Siblings met after decades. Old lovers embraced. Strangers kissed through wire fences now pulled apart. The wall had tried to silence them, but on that night it became the loudest silence in history, broken not by bombs, but by joy. And in those early morning hours, Berlin was whole again. Not yet officially, but undeniably. The wall had fallen, but the path to healing was just beginning. In the weeks that followed November 9th, 1989, Berlin transformed. Borders stayed open. Guard towers were abandoned. Bulldozers moved in. Pieces of the wall were chiseled away, kept as souvenirs, sold in markets sent around the world. Each fragment is a symbol of something bigger, a victory of unity over division. On October 3rd, 1990, less than a year later, East and West Germany were officially reunified. The flags changed. The maps were redrawn. Berlin was no longer an island, no longer a front line. It was once again the capital of a single sovereign nation. But reunification was not instant harmony. East and West had grown apart, not just in wealth and infrastructure, but in memory. East Germans, or Osses, had lived under surveillance and restriction. West Germans, or Wesses, had lived in freedom, but often misunderstood what life behind the wall could cost. The physical barrier had been removed, but emotional ones took longer. Still, Berlin moved forward. The Brandenburg Gate, once trapped in the death strip between two worlds, became a symbol of celebration. Unity Day became a national holiday. Streets were renamed. Statues came down, and still standing pieces of the wall were left as memorials, not to glorify the past, but to remember it. Today, Berlin is a city reborn. Its walls are now covered in art. Its once divided train lines now run uninterrupted. Where soldiers once stood with rifles, children now play. And where silence once lingered, music flows. But the memory endures. Museums and markers remind visitors where the wall once stood. Small brass plaques on sidewalks name those who died trying to cross. And every year, Berliners light candles on the anniversary of the wall's fall, not in celebration alone, but in reflection. Because the story of the Berlin Wall is not just about division, it's about resilience, about the quiet courage of those who stayed, the daring of those who fled, the voices that refused to be silenced. And in a world that still builds walls, Berlin remains a whisper, a reminder that even the tallest structures can crumble when people choose to stand together. The wall is gone, but the lessons remain. Long. Before the violin took its shape, the world was already filled with stringed voices, soft, trembling notes that danced through temples, courts, and villages. The idea of drawing sound from string was ancient, older than memory itself, and for centuries humanity experimented with ways to make wood, gut, and bow create something that resembled song. The earliest known bowed instruments came not from Europe, but from Central Asia and the Middle East. The rebab, with its round belly and haunting tone, spread through Islamic culture and into North Africa and Spain. In Byzantine lands, the lyra echoed in palaces and town squares. In medieval Europe, the fiddle and the viol took root. Flat-backed, fretted instruments, often played in ensembles or to accompany dance. These early instruments shared a spirit, if not a shape. They used a bow to stroke the strings, creating sustained tones that mimicked the human voice. But they lacked something, a certain clarity, projection, and flexibility. The music of the Renaissance was growing richer, more expressive. Composers longed for instruments that could match their expanding vision, and so the search for a more refined sound began. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, a new design began to emerge. It wasn't the product of one man or one moment, but a gradual evolution shaped by trial, error, and intuition. Luthiers, string instrument makers, experimented with curved tops, arched backs, and F-shaped sound holes, searching for balance between resonance and control. The idea of four strings tuned in fifths took hold. A smaller body, easier to handle, and more agile in voice became preferred. And most importantly, the instrument was designed not to sit on the lap or be cradled like a viol, but to rest on the shoulder, held close like a companion. This was not just a technical change, it was emotional. It made the player part of the instrument and the instrument part of the player. And though it had no official name at first, this new form, this slender, curved, expressive creature, was the birth of what we would come to call the violin. Delicate, powerful, and timeless. In the heart of northern Italy, nestled beside the slow-moving waters of the Po River, lies the quiet city of Cremona. In the 16th century, this was not a city of armies or kings. It was a city of artisans. The streets echoed not with cannons, but with chisels tapping wood, with hands smoothing varnish, with music drifting softly from behind shutters. It was here in Cremona's workshops that the violin found its true home. No one can say exactly why Cremona became the cradle of violin making. Perhaps it was the humidity in the air, ideal for curing tonewood. Perhaps it was the abundance of alpine spruce and Balkan maple, the perfect marriage of softness and strength. Or perhaps it was the people, humble craftsmen with careful hands and keen ears, who gave the violin its soul. Among them was Andrea Amati, born around 1505, a luthier whose vision would shape music for centuries. In his small workshop, Amati began to refine the form of this young instrument. He carved its body with elegant symmetry, gave it four strings tuned in perfect fifths, and added F-shaped sound holes that allowed the wood to breathe and sing. He didn't invent the violin out of nothing, but he gave it consistency, beauty, and balance. His instruments were commissioned by nobility, including the French court. The violin, once a curiosity, was now a work of art, adorned with delicate decorations and royal crests, capable of both courtly grace and peasant joy. The city itself became a musical forge. Amati's sons and grandsons carried on the tradition, refining his designs and teaching others. New names emerged: Guarneri, Stradivari, each adding their voice to the evolving language of sound. Cremona's violin makers didn't work from plans. There were no blueprints, no machines. Each instrument was born from the eye, the ear, and the hand, measured by feel, shaped by instinct, finished with care. The sound was tested not with tools, but by playing. And so, in the shaded rooms of this quiet Italian town, the violin was born, not just as an instrument, but as a vessel of emotion destined to sing in cathedrals, concert halls, and hearts across the world. As the 17th century unfolded, the violin had become more than a novel invention. It was now a voice waiting to be perfected. And in the quiet streets of Cremona, that perfection took shape, not in marble or paint, but in wood. Enter Antonio Stradivari, born around 1644, a student, perhaps of Niccolò Amati. He would become the most celebrated luthier in history. In his workshop on Corso Garibaldi, Stradivari carved violins that seemed touched by something divine. The curves, the arching, the varnish, all exact, all elegant. His instruments didn't just resonate, they spoke. Each violin bore the Latin label Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis, and soon musicians across Europe began to seek them out. His violins projected power in large halls, but still retained warmth and intimacy. Even today, centuries later, no modern instrument has fully surpassed them. But Stradivari was not alone. Down another lane in Cremona, another genius worked, Giuseppe Guarneri del Cassu. A member of the Guarneri family, Giuseppe crafted violins that were darker, fiercer, more untamed. Where Stradivari's voice was golden, Guarneri's was raw and bold, favored by players who wanted passion over polish. Each violin bore unique traits, subtle asymmetries, signature scrolls, mysterious varnishes, and yet all shared one thing: a soul. These weren't factory-made instruments. They were sculpted individually with human breath and human error, and somehow that made them more alive. The world began to notice. The violin moved from courtly circles into the spotlight. Performers demanded instruments that could sing, weep, dazzle, and only Cremona's finest would do. Centuries later, these masterpieces will be treasured beyond imagination. A single Stradivarius could sell for millions. Museums displayed them under glass. Historians analyzed their wood with microscopes, trying to unlock their secret. But in the end, their magic couldn't be measured. It was not just in the varnish or the grain. It was in the hands that made them, and in the hands that would one day play them. The violins of Stradivari and Guarneri were not instruments. They were voices preserved in maple and spruce, meant to outlive their makers, to whisper beauty long after silence. In its earliest days, the violin was a guest in the great halls of nobility. It played softly in the background, dancing alongside lutes and harpsichords, offering sweetness to royal feasts and courtly gatherings. But in time, the violin would leave its modest seat and step boldly into the spotlight, not as accompaniment, but as a voice of its own. As Europe entered the Baroque period, music began to shift. Composers no longer wrote only for kings. They wrote for feeling, for grandeur, for drama. The violin, agile and expressive, was perfectly suited for this transformation. It could soar like a bird, whisper like a secret, or cry like a human soul. One of the first to realize its power was Arcangelo Corelli. In Rome, he composed violin sonatas and concerti grossi that showed the instrument's elegance and versatility. His music was lyrical, graceful, and precise. The violin no longer just followed the melody. It was the melody. Then came Antonio Vivaldi, a priest and virtuoso in Venice. He wrote hundreds of violin concertos, each one a vivid painting in sound. His most famous, The Four Seasons, transformed weather into music. Spring's blossoms, summer's storms, autumn's harvest, winter's chill, all portrayed through a violin strings. The instrument was now a storyteller, capable of portraying the world's rhythms. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, the violin had become the jewel of the orchestra. Concert halls replaced courtrooms. Public performances welcomed common citizens, not just royalty. And on these new stages, the violin led the way, commanding attention, demanding emotion. Its shape had not changed much. The instrument itself was still slender and delicate, but its presence had grown. It was no longer a quiet companion. It was a voice for composers, a challenge for performers, and a bridge between the private and the public. The violin had stepped out of the salon and onto the world stage, and with each performance, each concerto, and each trembling note, it proved that it was not just another instrument. It was the heart of music by the 19th century. The violin was no longer confined to elegance. It had become a force of raw expression, capable of thrilling crowds and revealing the most intimate corners of the human soul. And leading this transformation was a man who seemed to be born of myth, Niccolò Paganini. Tall, pale, with long black hair and eyes that burned, Paganini was both genius and enigma. When he played, his fingers blurred across the fingerboard. He leapt across octaves, bent notes into cries, and coaxed sounds from the violin no one thought possible. Rumors swirled. Some said he had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for his gifts. In truth, Paganini had simply mastered the violin in a way no one had before. He invented techniques that pushed the instrument to its limits. Left-hand pizzicato, double stops, rapid harmonics. His compositions weren't just difficult. They were daring, theatrical, and emotional. Audiences were mesmerized, composers were inspired, and the violin was now seen not only as a beautiful instrument, but as a mirror of human passion. Others followed. Joseph Joachim, the poetic interpreter of Brahms, Pablo de Sarasate, whose elegance matched Paganini's fire for its Chrysler, who infused charm and warmth into every phrase. Each left their fingerprint not only on the violin's music, but on the violin itself. Composers responded to this new era of virtuosity. They wrote violin concertos that demanded more than just skill. They demanded souls. Mendelssohn's concerto sparkled like moonlight. Tchaikovsky's burned with heartbreak. Brahms thundered with intensity. The violin was asked to feel everything. And it did. No longer limited to chords or accompaniment, the violin had become a solo, a storyteller. It could now sing of joy and sorrow, fury and longing in a single note. It could say what words could not. And for the listener, the experience was personal. The violin didn't just play music. It reached inside and stirred something ancient, something aching and beautiful. It was no longer just about performance. The violin had become the voice of the soul. To play the violin is an art, but to make one is something even more elusive. The violin is not assembled. It is sculpted, coaxed from wood with patience, instinct, and centuries of inherited knowledge. No factory or machine can replicate the hands of a master luthier. The process begins with wood. Not just any wood, but carefully chosen pieces with the right grain, age, and resonance. Spruce for the top, light and vibrant maple for the back and sides. Strong and flexible, the wood must be seasoned, sometimes for decades, to reach its perfect voice. Then comes the carving. The arch of the body must be just so. The thickness of the plates, the exact shape of the F-holes, the curve of the scroll, all impact the sound. Luthiers work slowly, listening as they shave away slivers. The goal is not perfection, but balance. Between strength and vibration, brilliance and warmth. And then there is the varnish, a mystery that has puzzled scientists for centuries. The golden glow of a Stradivarius, the dark fire of a Guarneri. Each was finished with secret blends of oils, resins, and pigments. Was the magic in the ingredients or in the hands that applied them? Modern researchers have X-rayed CT scans and chemically analyzed the great violins of the past. They've measured frequencies, modeled acoustics, even recreated 3D printed copies. And yet, no one has fully unlocked the secret, because the secret may not be in the material, but in the relationship. A great violin is more than its parts. It is the product of hours spent listening, adjusting, feeling. The luthier taps the wood, bends the grain, senses its potential. There is no manual for this, only experience passed quietly from one generation to the next. Even today, in small workshops around the world, violins are still made this way, by hand, by heart. Each one is slightly different because each piece of wood has its own story, and once the instrument is finished, it waits silent, breathless, until the bow draws across its strings and brings it to life. The violin does not just sing, it remembers how it was made. Though born in the hands of Italian luthiers, the violin did not stay in Europe. Its voice, so human, so adaptable, was destined to travel across mountains and oceans. Through trade routes and migration, the violin became a citizen of the world in Ireland and Scotland. It became the fiddle, lively, earthy, quick. It led dancers in pubs and village squares, spinning reels and jigs with infectious joy. There, the violin wasn't formal. It was familiar, passed from hand to hand, often learned by ear. It became a part of everyday life. In India, the violin was embraced into the world of Carnatic music, held differently, resting against the ankle while seated. The instrument was reimagined. Its voice began to echo ancient ragas, imitating the sliding, singing tones of a human voice in devotional music. It did not replace traditional instruments. It adapted, and in doing so, became sacred. In the Middle East, the violin took on the microtonal scales of Arabic and Persian music, often replacing the rebab and Comanche. In the hands of skilled players, it could weep and wail with intensity. Capturing the sorrow and beauty of centuries-old melodies in the Americas, it joined settlers and slaves, weaving into new musical forms. In the Appalachians, it shaped bluegrass and old-time music, while in Mexico, it danced in mariachi bands beneath wide-brimmed hats and desert stars. And in jazz, the violin found freedom, from Stefan Grappelli's smoky Parisian improvisations to the raw power of Stuff Smith. The instrument once confined to courts now swung, improvised and roared. Each culture tuned the violin to its own soul. Each gave it a new accent, a new purpose, a new place in the story. And yet the instrument remained the same. For strings, a curved body, a wooden bridge, and something else, something timeless. No matter the genre, the country, or the tradition, the violin kept one foot in history and the other in emotion. It could sound like a whisper or a wildfire. Perhaps that's its true power. The violin does not belong to any one place. It belongs wherever there is feeling. When the orchestra assembles, all eyes turn to the front, the place where the violins sit, row upon row, their polished wood gleaming beneath the lights, their bows rising in unison, ready to breathe life into the silence. In this world of sound, the violin wears the crown. It is the largest section in the orchestra, divided into firsts and seconds, each with a distinct voice. The first violins often carry the melody, soaring above the ensemble, agile and bright. The second violins, equally vital, weave harmonies and support, creating the rich tapestry of sound. At the head of it all sits the concertmaster, the lead violinist, and second only to the conductor. They cue the ensemble, tune the orchestra, and sometimes even take center stage as a soloist. Their role is not just musical, but symbolic, a bridge between leadership and collaboration. Composers have long known the power of this instrument. From the quiet shimmer of Debussy to the thunderous storms of Mahler, the violin adapts. Capable of tenderness or fire, simplicity or brilliance in orchestral scores, it is often given the first word and the last. But the concert stage is not just for symphonies. Violin soloists have risen to become some of the most revered artists in classical music. Names like Jaska Heifetz, David Oistrakh, Itzhak Perlman, and Hilary Hahn have filled halls with performances that feel less like concerts and more like conversations between soul and string. They perform concertos that challenge the limits of emotion and technique. Tchaikovsky's aching melodies, Sibelius's icy fire, Beethoven's quiet majesty all come alive when a single violin steps forward. The violin leads, it listens, it lifts, and when the orchestra swells behind it, the sound becomes not just music, but story. In the concert hall, under golden ceilings and velvet curtains, the violin has found its kingdom. It speaks in a language no words can match, telling tales of longing, love, fury, and joy. It does not need translation. It does not seek applause. It simply sings in a voice centuries old, yet forever young. Centuries have passed since the violin first sang in the hands of an Italian artisan, and yet its voice has never faded. From palace chambers to crowded subways, from grand concert halls to humble village dances, the violin endures not as a relic, but as a living, breathing soul of music. In an age of digital instruments and synthetic sound, the violin remains unchanged. It still begins as wood, cut, carved and shaped by hand. It still waits in silence until touched by bow and breath. No batteries, no wires, just tradition, tension, and the quiet power of resonance. New luthiers continue the craft, some of the same towns, even the same streets as Amati and Stradivari once walked. They work not from mass production, but from memory, mentorship, and intuition, and players, young and old. I still pick up the violin for the first time with a mixture of awe and reverence. Old violins, too, continue to live. Some are passed through generations, their varnish worn smooth by the hands of history. Others rest in velvet-lined cases, waiting for the right player to draw them back to life. A Stradivarius, built in the 1700s, can still hold a room in silence with a single note. But the violin is not confined to the past. It plays in film scores, in experimental jazz, in video games, and virtual reality. It speaks to audiences who have never heard a concerto, drawing emotion from ears that don't know its name. Because the violin does not need to be explained. Its language is universal. A cry in one culture is a cry in another. A lullaby is soft in any tone. And still, after all these years, the violin has one more miracle. It grows with you. A child's scratchy first notes become, in time, the song of their life. For the listener, too, it changes. What once felt bright might now feel nostalgic. What once was joyful might now bring tears. It evolves not in shape, but in meaning. Because the violin is not just an instrument, it is a companion to emotion, a vessel for memory, a voice that never forgets. And as long as there is silence in the world, the violin will be there, ready to sing again. Imagine being dressed in 12 layers of silk so tight you can barely breathe, your hair styled with enough pins to conduct lightning, and your feet forced into wooden shoes so high one wrong step could land you in the next life. Welcome to the daily grind of an Edo period courtesan. Yoshiwara, the most famous red light district of old Tokyo, wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a stage, a fantasy world wrapped in incense smoke, lantern glow, and heavy denial. To the outside world, courtesans were living here. They danced, they played shamisen, they recited poetry. But above all, they mastered the one talent society valued most, pretending everything was fine. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Behind the fans and flirtation, the courtesan's life was less Cinderella, more luxury hostage. These women were bought young, often sold by their families for a sack of rice and the vague promise of opportunity. They were trained like opera singers and gladiators combined. Make no mistake, they were elite, but they were also owned. Every step they took, every client they smiled at, every coin they earned belonged to someone else. Usually a brothel owner or oya, which is Japanese for overlord with good lighting. Courtesans were products, investments, and pregnancies. Well, that was considered the ultimate product defect. Because if there's one thing worse than losing money in business, it's having your best performing merchandise go out of service for 9 months. Now, in a perfect world, courtesan might have taken time off for a baby shower, a sabbatical, maybe a quiet retreat with prenatal yoga and hot stone therapy. But this wasn't a perfect world. This was Yoshiwara, where the only stones were the ones you might be stoned with if you broke a contract. Pregnancy didn't just mean losing work. It meant scandal. It meant punishment. It meant, quite literally, blood in the bathwater. So while the streets outside echoed with the clip-clop of platform shoes and sweet laughter, the inner chambers held darker truths, secrets whispered behind screens, remedies passed down not from healers, but from survivors. This was a world of velvet and iron, soft to the eye, brutal underneath. And for the courtesans living inside it, getting pregnant wasn't just a problem. It was a crisis wearing lipstick. If you've ever signed a contract without reading the fine print, congratulations. You've already shared something in common with an Edo-era courtesan. Except in her case, the fine print included phrases like "you will never own your life again." And oh, and by the way, don't get pregnant unless you enjoy pain, shame, and herbal poison. Courtesans didn't enter the industry with resumes and references. Most were sold into it as girls, sometimes as young as 7, by families who needed money or just didn't want another mouth to feed. It was the 1600s. Netflix wasn't around, so people entertained themselves by selling their daughters and blaming karma. Once inside the brothel, everything came with a price tag. The kimono she wore, the hair oil, the lessons in poetry, tea ceremony, and how to pretend you're thrilled by middle-aged men discussing rice taxes. By the time she was ready for clients, she already owed more money than a failed startup. Now the contract, and let's use that term lightly because she had no legal say in it, was basically a glorified leash. It dictated when she slept, who she served, how she smiled, and most importantly, that her uterus remained strictly decorative. Pregnancy. That wasn't in the brochure. And let's not forget the clients. A diverse collection of drunk samurai, emotionally starved merchants, and the occasional poet who thought whispering about cherry blossoms counted as foreplay. These men weren't looking for long-term commitment. Most weren't even looking for eye contact. And if they got a courtesan pregnant, they disappeared faster than your paycheck after payday. Of course, the brothel didn't blame the man. That would be far too progressive. Instead, the woman, the walking investment, was accused of carelessness, as if she had simply tripped and fallen into an accidental third trimester. In some establishments, even the suspicion of pregnancy was enough to get a courtesan reassigned to the bottom row. The clients with fewer teeth and more complaints. Or worse, she'd be locked away until the problem resolved itself. You see, this wasn't just about sex. It was about control, reputation, and money. And babies. Babies were bad for business because nothing ruins a romantic illusion faster than morning sickness. So what happens when a courtesan in Yoshiwara does the one thing she's absolutely not supposed to do? No, not fall in love. That's frowned upon, but survivable. We're talking about the big one. The moment her stomach starts growing for reasons other than bloat from too much fish soup. Pregnancy. The ultimate plot twist. See, in this elegant, silk-wrapped prison, getting pregnant wasn't a beautiful miracle. It was a career-ending biological betrayal in modern terms. It was like your iPhone suddenly deciding it wanted to be a toaster. Beautiful. Maybe. Useful. Not anymore. The courtesan's role was to entertain, seduce, and maintain the illusion that every client, no matter how hairy, drunk, or emotionally unstable, was her one true love. Baby, that shattered the fantasy. Suddenly, clients might remember that actions have consequences, and no one's paying premium rates to be reminded they left their real family across town. To the brothel, pregnancy wasn't a matter of health. It was a product malfunction. The courtesan's value depended on her availability. If she's busy gestating a small human, she's not serving tea, singing songs, or flirting with men old enough to be her grandfather. That means she's not making money, which means the brothel's not making money. Which means someone's going to be very, very angry. There were no sympathy cards, no congratulations on the new arrival banners. Just a lot of whispering behind fans and the looming threat of being demoted from living artwork to unmarketable liability. At best, she might be hidden away until the issue resolved itself, which, let's be honest, is a poetic way of saying handle it or else. At worst, she'd be thrown out penniless. With a reputation so tarnished, even the low-tier tea houses wouldn't touch her and the baby. Let's just say this wasn't exactly a culture built on maternity leave. Pregnancy in the courtesan world wasn't just forbidden, it was feared. Because once it happened, everything changed. The Oirin, who was once the glittering centerpiece of the district, became an unspoken warning to the others, a reminder cloaked in silence and shame. That bringing life into the world might very well end your own. You think in a place like Yoshiwara, where secrets flowed more freely than Seiki, that a little thing like pregnancy might be handled with quiet sympathy and delicate discretion. You know, the moment a courtesan suspected she was pregnant, a ticking clock started in her head. Not toward motherhood, but toward ruin. And make no mistake, she was on her own. There were no best friends rushing over her with comforting words and pickles. There were no spa days or maternity massages. There were just paper walls, fake smiles, and a whole lot of lying. Everything became a covert operation. Morning sickness. Blame it on bad shellfish. Fatigue. Just a little tired from dancing all night. Oh, Miss Cycle. Oh, you sweet summer child. Don't ever say that out loud. Beneath the surface-level glamour of painted faces and elegant kimonos was a parallel world of whispers, hushed rituals, and quiet panic. Courtesans shared remedies in code, passed down like haunted family recipes. Try the tea with 3 leaves, not 5. 5's for headaches. 3's for... well, you know. Even the act of checking if you were pregnant had to be done in secret. Some girls became experts at reading their bodies like they were decoding enemy messages. A missed period could mean anything, right? Stress, diet, Mercury being in retrograde. Or, as it was known in the Edo period, you pissed off another god again. And if you were certain, that's when the real performance began. You still had to work, still had to flirt, still had to endure being poured at by clients who definitely caused this in the first place without them ever suspecting a thing. It was emotional espionage in high heels. Some courtesans even alter the way they walk to hide changes in their body. They tighten their obi belts just a little more, risk fainting rather than showing the slightest bump. Vanity, no survival. And of course, all of this had to be done while still being enchanted. Because, heaven forbid, your emotional distress interrupts someone's evening of purchased romance. Beneath the layers of silk and powdered faces were women quietly waging war against their own biology, and against a world that demanded perfection but offered no grace. And it all had to stay hidden. Because once the secret got out, the kimono wasn't the only thing that could come undone. Let's talk about tea. Not the kind you sip while gossiping about your neighbor's suspicious new kimono. No, this tea had a very different purpose, one that came with cramping, bleeding, and the faint possibility of death. Welcome to the courtesan's secret weapon, herbal abortion brews. Because when you couldn't exactly stroll into a pharmacy and ask for one discreet termination, please, you turned to Mother Nature and hoped she was in a merciful mood. The most infamous players in this deadly tea party, mugwort, safflower, and kanzo, otherwise known as licorice root, which sounds innocent until you realize it was taken in horrifying doses that could make your uterus flip a table. These weren't your garden variety sleepy time teas. These were brewed like potions from a grim fairy tale, steeped long, taken hot, and chugged down in desperate gulps while praying to every god and ancestor you could remember. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it also destroy your insides, induce hallucinations, or give you a fever that felt like a preview of the afterlife? Also, yes, the recipes varied. Some are passed between courtesans like coded scrolls. Add ginger if you wanted to act faster, one might say. Don't use too much safflower or your skin will start to burn, another might whisper. It was part science, part superstition, an entirely unregulated disaster. The worst part? You had to keep working the whole time. Imagine entertaining clients, smiling sweetly, making small talk about moonlight and cherry blossoms, all while bleeding internally and hoping this was the cup that did the trick. And if the tea didn't work well, that just meant it was time to move on to the next method, because in this game there were no do-overs, just a terrifying ladder of solutions, each one darker than the last. For some, herbal tea was enough. For others, it was just the opening act in a play titled, Please Don't Let the Brothel Find Out. But the truth was clear. In the pleasure quarters, even something as innocent as tea could become a lethal gamble. And when your life is held together by silk. smiles, and secrets. One wrong sip could unravel everything. If the tea didn't work, and let's be honest, herbal roulette wasn't exactly foolproof. There's always another option. More hands-on. Enter the midwives. Not the sweet, smiling birth attendants you might imagine from folktales. No, these were women of shadows, ghosts in the alleyways of Yoshiwara. Legends passed between trembling lips. No signage, no appointments, no receipts. Just pain, blood, and a whole lot of praying. They were called Barsan, literally old women, and many of them had once been courtesans themselves, retired not by choice, but by the harsh reality of time. And with no savings, no pensions, and no market for gray-haired flirtation, they became specialists in fixing problems. Unofficial ones. You didn't find them. You heard about them. A whispered name, a folded note tucked in a sleeve. You knocked on the right door at the wrong time of night and hoped you brought enough coin and enough courage. The tools. Usually a mix of crude implements, boiling water, cloth rags, and whatever's lying around. Surgical steel, sanitation. A concept for another century. No anesthesia, no aftercare. Just grit your teeth and hope the gods are too busy to notice. And yet, to desperate courtesans, these midwives were saviors. Grim, sharp-fingered saviors who didn't ask questions and didn't tell lies. Payment wasn't always money. Some took hairpins, trinkets, or silk sashes. One story tells of a midwife who accepted a rare perfume bottle in exchange for silence, then wore it daily like a war medal. The risk? Enormous. Infection, hemorrhaging, permanent infertility, or worse. Many girls never returned to the brothel. The official explanation? She caught a fever. The unofficial one. She caught reality with both hands and didn't survive it. If something went wrong, there was no legal recourse. After all, what could you tell the authorities? Hello, officer. I illegally sought an abortion while working in a government-regulated sex district. Could you please arrest me last? These midwives were the final stop before ruin or exile. No training, no ceremony, just candlelight, trembling hands, and the hope that today death wasn't charging full price. And somehow, even in this world of blood and fear, trust was forged between the broken and the ones who helped them break in silence. In most cultures, a hot bath is a symbol of peace, relaxation, and a little self-care after a long day of pretending to like your job. But in the world of Edo period courtesans, a hot bath could mean something far more sinister and far more permanent. Welcome to the boiling bath method, a home remedy that promises to take care of the problem by turning your womb into a sauna from hell. The idea was simple. Soak in a bath so hot your body would forcibly reject the pregnancy. Think of it as a spa day designed by a sadistic herbalist with a grudge against reproductive health. The method was whispered about in hushed tones behind paper screens. Stay in until you feel dizzy, they'd say. If you faint, it's working. Medical advice at its finest. Some girls added special herbs to the water. Mugwort again, of course, because apparently that plant was the Swiss army knife of uterine sabotage. Others drank sake beforehand, because why not combine internal poisoning with external overheating? It was dangerous. Extremely dangerous. You weren't just risking the pregnancy, you were risking your own life. Scalding burns, shock, heat stroke. There are accounts of women fainting mid-bath and being dragged out unconscious, only to die quietly in some hidden room while the brothel continued its evening business. Nothing ruins a client's mood like stepping over a corpse on the way to his sack tray. And yet the method persisted because it was fast, cheap, and relatively discreet. No tools, no midwife, just water, willpower, and a very high pain tolerance. The courtesans were told to breathe through the pain, to stay calm, to keep quiet, even while their bodies boiled from the inside out. Also, the brothel wouldn't lose its best money maker because nothing screams customer service like telling a girl to self-harm quietly in the back room. If the bath worked, the pregnancy ended. If it didn't, well, there were always darker options. In a world where a baby could cost you your status, your contract, or your life, a near-fatal bath wasn't extreme. It was just another Tuesday. When herbal teas failed and boiling baths didn't quite do the trick, courtesans turned to another time-honored technique in the ancient art of pretending everything's fine. Tight binding. The idea? If you wrap your abdomen tightly enough, maybe, just maybe, you can squeeze the baby out of existence. Or at the very least, hide it long enough to avoid a scandal and a demotion to the drunk uncles and smelly merchants' clientele tier. Enter stomach binding. Known as hirogi, it was basically a DIY wound forcing. Long strips of cloth were wrapped again and again around the lower torso until the courtesan resembled a very glamorous sushi roll, one holding in something she desperately didn't want to deliver. Of course, there were problems, minor things like breathing and digestion, and that pesky little issue of internal organ compression. But in the pleasure districts, comfort was always optional. Image was everything. Some courtesans bound themselves so tightly they could barely sit down, let alone dance or tea, or carry on a conversation about the beauty of the cherry blossoms. But they did it anyway, because a visible pregnancy was social suicide. And in Yoshiwara, appearances weren't just maintained, they were enforced. The courtesans became experts at posture control. Standing up straight wasn't about elegance. It was about keeping pressure on the bone. Slouching meant loosening the bind. Loosening the bind meant discovery. Discovery meant doom. Some even slept with the binding still on, as if constricting their midsection 24/7 would convince the fetus to rethink its life choices and quietly back out. It didn't, of course, and binding didn't stop the pregnancy. At best, it delayed the reveal. At worst, caused complications. Ruptured tissues, dizziness, fainting, internal bleeding. But none of that mattered when the alternative was losing everything you'd bled and smiled and danced to build. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't even about safety. It was about survival and illusion. Because in the world of Japanese courtesans, the belly must remain flat, the smile serene, and the truth tightly wrapped beneath layers of silk and shame. Even if what you're really hiding is heartbreak, at some point you have to admire the creativity. Because when teas, baths, and body wrapping fail to correct the issue, courtesans sometimes turn to the most comforting thing available in any crisis: food. And not just any food, rice balls soaked in sake. Yes, fermented rice, wrapped lovingly in cloth and consumed in hopes that it might dissolve an unwanted pregnancy like yesterday's gossip. The logic, dubious. The desperation, very real. Folklore whispered that vinegar, saker, and certain fermented foods had weakening effects on the womb. Courtesans were told by each other, by old servants, by the midwives with half an herb shop in their apron, that if you ate just the right combination of ingredients, you could wash the seed away. It sounds like a tragic fairy tale, and in many ways it was. The recipe varied by district. In one brothel, the Goda method involved warm sake mixed with crushed garlic and pickled plum, which probably tasted like despair with a hint of nausea. Another popular combo was rice balls marinated in vinegar, ginger, and shame. Served cold. Very cold. Did it work? You know the answer. Not really, unless you count vomiting and intestinal distress as results. But in a world where your entire future hinged on hiding your condition, even a placebo with side effects was worth trying. Some courtesans were told to chant little verses while eating, part spiritual ritual, part emotional coping mechanism. Something along the lines of return to the river, little child, for now is not your time. And then they'd swallow, try not to gag. There's something incredibly human and heartbreakingly naive. In this method, a kind of hopeful magic passed between trembling hands, because unlike the midwife or the boiling bath, this one felt gentler, almost like a ritual, almost like a prayer. But no amount of scare could rewrite biology. And while the rice balls offered comfort, they rarely offered results. Still, courtesans kept trying, because when your body isn't your own, and your choices are limited to pain or secrecy, sometimes the only power you have left is believing in something, even if that something is a soggy rice ball soaked in old liquor and whispered regret. So let's say a courtesan gets pregnant. She's terrified, bleeding from herbal teas, possibly half poached from a boiling bath, and she's tried every rice ball in the folklore cookbook. Naturally, the next logical step might be, tell the father. Sweet child, that man is already gone. Courtesans didn't operate in a world where paternity was a shared responsibility. They operated in a fantasy, one the client paid for. And the minute that fantasy tried to become reality, the man vanished like a samurai in a scandal. Most clients were married. Others were officials. Nobles or merchants with reputations they absolutely did not want associated with illegitimate children from the pleasure quarters. So when that courtesan nervously hinted there might be consequences, the reaction was almost universal. "I'm sorry, I'm moving to Osaka permanently. Also, I don't know you." Courtesans were trained not to expect loyalty. That's why any emotional attachment was considered dangerous. But still, many women held on to a fragile hope that the man they saw week after week, who brought gifts and shared secrets, might do the right thing. He didn't. Even in rare cases where a client wanted to help, there were layers of legal and social barriers that made acknowledgement nearly impossible. Claiming the child meant scandal. Scandal meant consequences, and for most Edo men, consequences were the one thing more terrifying than commitment. Some tried to leave money quietly. A few gold coins slipped to a brothel servant with instructions to take care of it. Others pretended they didn't recognize the woman at all. You have to understand the courtesan was a fantasy, and fantasy doesn't get pregnant. So when reality knocked in the form of morning sickness, swelling feet, or a missed cycle, the men did what men have done in many chapters of history. They got really, really good at ghosting. The father's silence wasn't just literal. It was cultural, institutional, practically a tradition. No messages, no visits, no names on scrolls. Just another shadow in a world already thick with them. And for the courtesan, there was no time to grieve or rage. There was only the next performance, the next lie, and the silence growing in her womb. If pregnancy was a personal disaster, then letting the brothel find out. That was the apocalypse, complete with dramatic consequences, zero sympathy, and absolutely no baby shower. You see, the brothel wasn't just your workplace. It was your world. Your landlord, your agent, your stylist, your parole officer, all rolled into one. And like most institutions that cared deeply about profits and very little about people, had one golden rule: don't get pregnant. So what happened when a courtesan slipped up? Well, it wasn't handled with sensitivity or a calm sit down with the boss. No, we're here to support you vibes. Just a lot of side-eye, passive-aggressive fan snapping and the looming sense that you were about to be thrown under the gilded bus. The moment the suspicion arose, maybe you were walking a little slower, eating a little less, or just existing too carefully. The whispers began. First came the rumors. She's getting fat. She looks pale. She skipped her cycle. I heard it from the maid who empties the chamber pots. Then came the surveillance. Suddenly, you weren't allowed to leave the room alone. Your friends were asked to report on your activities. You were given less work, not out of compassion, but because they were prepping your replacement. And finally, if they were sure, punishment. Now, this varies depending on the brothel's mood, status, and general appetite for cruelty. That day, some demoted the courtesan to the lowest ranks, forcing her to serve the roughest, drunkest, least hygienic clients imaginable. Others confined her to her room until she dealt with the issue. Some simply kicked her out. No money, no support. Just a silk bundle of shame and a warning to others. In more elite houses, there was the illusion of discretion. They claimed she was on retreat or visiting family, but everyone knew what that meant. Pregnancy wasn't just a personal failing, it was a business risk, a contamination of the illusion. And in a system built entirely on fantasy, reality was considered rude. So when the brothel found out, there were no tears, no hugs, just cold calculations, and the slow, quiet erasure of a woman who broke the one rule everyone pretended wasn't already broken. When you've tried every tea, choked down the vinegar rice balls, nearly boiled yourself like an overseasoned dumpling, and the brothel's starting to look at you like a faulty lantern, you've got two options. Confess and face the consequences. Run like hell. And some courtesans chose exactly that. They disappeared in the districts. They were branded Nijijoro, runaway prostitutes, the term that translates roughly to she messed up the fantasy. Now go fetch her back. Because running away wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. You were property. And when property walks out the door with a baby on board, the brothel takes it personally. But that didn't stop them. Some courtesans fled in the dead of night, disguised in plain robes with their hair undone, abandoning their ornate identities the way a snake sheds its skin. They slipped through alleyways, rode carts meant for laundry, or hid inside barrels. Yes, really barrels. It was dramatic, dangerous, and desperately cinematic. Where did they go? Anywhere that didn't require perfume and pretending. Cousin's farm, a mountain shrine, a fishing village where no one asked questions unless you stole their sake. Places where the name Yoshiwara didn't open doors. It closed them. Not everyone made it. Some were caught, dragged back, and punished publicly, both as a warning and a morale booster for the rest of the staff. Look what happens when you act like you have free will. Others disappeared so completely they became urban legends. Did you hear about the Warren who ran off to become a nun? They say one lives in the hills now, reading fortunes and raising her child like a ghost. But running wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage, one where you traded makeup and money for silence and survival. And yet, for many, it was the only choice that still felt like a choice. Because when your entire world is painted in rules and red lipstick, the scariest thing isn't leaving, it's staying. And pretending it didn't happen. So they ran. Not for revenge. Not for rebellion. Just for the smallest, most dangerous luxury of all. Well, let's say a courtesan couldn't run, couldn't drink enough tea, couldn't fake enough smiles. And eventually the lie she was carrying became too big to hide beneath the sill. There was only one thing left to do. Give birth quietly, invisibly, preferably without anyone noticing. Welcome to the underground world of silent deliveries, where motherhood arrived in the dead of night, behind sliding paper doors with towels stuffed in mouths to muffle screams. No birthing chairs, no midwives in cheerful aprons, no cries of joy, just urgency terror. And if you were lucky, someone who knew how to boil water without asking questions. Sometimes it happened in secret rooms, ones the brothel conveniently didn't know about. Other times it happened in storage closets, behind drapes, or even outdoors under cover of darkness. Because nothing says a beautiful miracle of life like squatting behind a bathhouse with a handkerchief in your teeth. The courtesan had to remain calm because if she made too much noise, she wasn't just risking scandal, she was risking exile or worse. And there was no fanfare, no name-picking ceremony, just a bundle of blood and breath, wrapped in a cloth and hidden before dawn. If she was very fortunate, a servant girl or an old retired courtesan might help. These were women who'd seen all and kept their mouths shut tighter than a lacquered box. They brought towels, boiled water, whispered prayers, and never asked what would happen to the baby afterward. And the baby. Well, that was the question no one wanted to answer. Some were taken away immediately. Others stayed hidden for a few days, tucked in a corner, fed in silence, loved with trembling hands. But everyone knew this was temporary. The child didn't belong here. There was no room in the pleasure quarters for innocence. What these women endured, physically, emotionally, is almost unspeakable. But they did it. Because the alternative was worse. They gave birth like ghosts, then wiped their faces, fixed their hair, and returned to the brothel floor as if nothing had happened. No maternity leave, no postnatal care. Just another performance. Because in Yoshiwara, the show must go on. If a courtesan managed to give birth in secret, there was still one problem left. A tiny, crying, impossibly fragile problem. And in the pleasure districts, babies weren't blessings. They were liabilities with lungs loud, hungry, and impossible to explain to your next client. So what did she do? She walked under cover of night to the edge of town, to the roadside, to a place built for tragedy, a shrine of abandonment known as Koya or Abbasid sites. These were quiet stone shrines tucked into the corners of society, halfway between a place of worship and a dumping ground. They weren't publicized, but everyone knew they existed, and everyone knew what they were for. A mother, often a courtesan, a servant, or any woman society had failed, would leave her infant on the steps, swaddled tightly, sometimes with a name. sometimes with nothing but a small charm or folded prayer paper tucked into the cloth. And then she walked away. No goodbye, no witness, no turning back. If she was lucky, a monk or kind stranger might find the child. Sometimes a temple took them in, raising them in silence. Other times, they were passed to orphanages, or into servitude, or simply vanished into the folds of forgotten stories. The courtesan didn't leave her child because she didn't care. She left it because there was no other path. The brothel wouldn't allow children. The law offered no protection. And even if she ran, what future could she offer a baby while hiding from bounty hunters with nothing but a comb and a blood-stained obi? So she did the unthinkable, not out of cruelty, but out of love, twisted by desperation. Some shrines were said to be haunted. Locals claimed they heard crying at night, not from the babies, but from the women who left them. Echoes of regret carved into the wind like invisible gravestones. It wasn't just a shrine. It was an altar to every dream that never stood a chance. And the worst part? No one ever asked who left the child, because in the floating world of courtesans, everyone already knew. They just pretended not to in the eyes of Japanese tradition. An unborn or aborted child isn't just a medical footnote, it's a spirit. And in the world of the courtesan, these spirits were everywhere. They were called Mizuko, literally water children. A poetic name for something profoundly heavy. The souls of children who were never born, or who were born and never raised. And no matter how silent the birth, how quiet the abandonment, these spirits didn't simply disappear. They lingered. Mizuko were believed to float between worlds, not fully in the realm of the living, yet not quite passed on either. In many ways, they mirrored the women who carried them. Courtesans, after all, also existed between realities, glamorous but enslaved, adored but discarded, present but unseen. And so a strange kinship formed, one ghost carrying another. Some women were haunted, not just emotionally, but spiritually. It was said Mizuko could cause misfortune, illness, or nightmares if not properly honored. And the courtesans, who had no freedom in life, sought freedom for their unborn in death. That's where the Mizuko Q came in. A secret ritual, a whispered apology, a kind of emotional exorcism dressed in prayer beads and incense. The ceremony was small, sometimes held at a quiet temple outside the district, sometimes performed in private, late at night, with only a flickering lantern and trembling hands. Offerings were left. Baby toys, flowers, little red bibs tied around Jizo statues, the Buddhist guardian of children and travelers. Courtesans couldn't raise their children, but they could ask the gods to protect them. It was the only parental act they were allowed. And it was heartbreaking. Imagine lighting incense for the child you never got to name, whispering I'm sorry, not because you didn't love them, but because you did in a world that didn't give you room to show it. Some came back again and again, year after year, unable to forget. Others visited once and never returned, too afraid to reopen the wound. But all of them carried it. Because even in a world built on forgetting, some memories refused to drown. Mizuko weren't just spirits. They were reminders that love existed, however briefly, even in the darkest corners of silk and shadow. In Yoshiwara, the pleasure district was always loud. Laughter echoed down lantern-lit alleys. Music floated through the sliding doors. Perfumed clients shouted about love they didn't mean. Courtesans giggled, poured sake, and told 100 lies an hour, all for the price of illusion. But beneath all that noise, something remained perfectly still. Silence. A specific, deliberate kind. The kind that wrapped itself around certain topics, like a velvet chokehold. And at the center of that silence was the unwritten rule. We don't talk about pregnancy. Every courtesan carried an invisible weight. Contracts, expectations, debt, desire. And for the ones who got pregnant, that weight tripled overnight. It pressed on their lungs, their decisions, their very skin. But somehow they kept dancing. They still performed, still laughed at jokes they'd heard 1,000 times. Still painted their lips blood red, pretended they weren't bleeding somewhere else entirely. Because strength in Yoshiwara wasn't about force, it was about endurance. The ability to carry your pain like it was part of your costume. To cry only when your makeup was waterproof, to bind your wound, bind your heart, and keep serving tea as if nothing inside you was unraveling. Some might say they were trapped, and they were. But even in the cage, they found ways to sing. They learned to master control, not over their fate, but over how they wore it. They consoled each other with gestures instead of words. They protected secrets, not because they were ashamed, but because trust was rare and sacred. They taught younger girls the quiet codes, how to hide, how to lie convincingly, how to survive one more day in a world that profited from their obedience. They weren't fragile like glass. They were fragile like porcelain, beautiful, dangerous to mishandle, and capable of enduring centuries of pressure. No one wrote poems about that strength. There were no plays, no woodblock prints, only silence and survival. But if you looked closely at the tilt of the head, the narrowing of the eyes, the slight tremble in the hands pouring tea, it was there. They were artists, yes, but they were also warriors, painted in rouge and wrapped in silk. And for those who carried the unbearable, the unborn, the forgotten, the shame no one dared name, the fact that they still stood at all. That was strength, disguised as elegance, disguised as grace. But make no mistake, it was strength. They were never supposed to be remembered. Courtesans existed to be consumed, not known, admired, desired, hated. Yes, but understood. Never. And once they faded from the spotlight, they were swept aside like yesterday's incense smoke, especially the ones who got pregnant. There were no statues for them, no poems carved in stone, no history books recording the names of the girls who bled quietly behind the screens, who left offerings for children no one else ever saw, who disappeared in the night with swollen bellies and broken contracts. But they existed, and they mattered. Behind every fan flutter and practiced laugh was a human being surviving the impossible. They carried beauty like armor and shame like a shadow. They were punished for wanting love, exiled for making life, and buried in the footnotes of history like an inconvenience. And yet they still found ways to fight. Not with swords, not with speeches, but by enduring, by holding on to moments of kindness in a world designed to forget them, by protecting each other in small, defiant ways. A whispered warning, a smuggled remedy, a silent prayer at a shrine that smelled of old moss and ghost stories. Remembering them isn't just about justice. It's about the truth. It's about pulling back the silk and acknowledging what was really there all along. The heartbreak, the resilience, the quiet rage of women forced to choose between survival and self. They weren't weak. They weren't shameful. They were trapped in a system that commodified their bodies and criminalized their humanity. And still they endured. Some are honored only by the red bibs on weathered Jizo statues. Some are remembered in the aching melodies of old shamisen songs. Most are unnamed, unheard, and unseen. But tonight, we remember them not just the courtesans they were trained to be, but the mothers they were never allowed to become. The daughters sold too soon, the women who survived the unspoken war inside the brothel walls they live in. Shadows. But that doesn't mean they should stay there. It didn't start with a bang. No, the moment that would transform the American West forever came quietly, as soft as the flow of the American River itself. It was January 24th, 1848. James W. Marshall, a carpenter overseeing the construction of a sawmill for a man named John Sutter, was inspecting the tail race, the ditch that allowed water to flow away from the wheel. The water was rushing a little too fast. Rocks had shifted. The soil needed clearing. Then he saw it. A flicker, a flash, a yellow gleam in the muddy shallows. Gold. He picked it up, rolled it between his fingers. Bit it because that's what people did in those days to check if wealth had actually arrived. He showed it to a colleague, then to Sutter. And Sutter, upon realizing what this meant, didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He panicked because Sutter had a dream, an empire of agriculture, peaceful, profitable, and utterly not filled with treasure hunters. A gold rush would bring chaos, squatters, thieves, land disputes. And it did. Just not right away. You see, for a short moment they managed to keep it quiet. Secret fortune. A private revolution. That moment didn't last. Within weeks, whispers echoed across salons and trading posts. By spring, sailors in San Francisco were abandoning their ships mid-voyage. Entire towns emptied overnight. Men ran from jobs, from homes, even from families, all chasing a river-borne dream. What began as a fluke on the edge of a sawmill would ignite the single largest mass migration in American history. Gold fever was airborne, and no one was immune. By the time word reached the East Coast and trickled across oceans to China, Chile, and Australia, it was too late. California was no longer just a distant frontier. It was an obsession, and all because one man saw a glimmer in the dirt. It wasn't the first time gold had been found in America, but it was the first time it rewrote the future overnight, because this wasn't just a discovery. It was a spark, and everything was about to catch fire. By the time 1849 arrived, California was no longer a distant rumor. It was a magnet, and the world was iron. Tens of thousands of people, mostly men, were on the move from New York to New Orleans, from London to Lima, from Canton to Cape Horn. The rush had begun. They came on foot by wagon, through blistering deserts and over ice-choked mountains. They came on ships that rounded the tip of South America, months at sea, just for the chance at a golden miracle. They were dreamers, desperate men, adventurers, crooks, widows in disguise. Entire ships were abandoned in San Francisco's bay, their crews running inland with shovels and gold pans. Some called it madness. Others called it destiny. By the end of that single year, California's population exploded from barely 15,000 to over 90,000. San Francisco ballooned from a sleepy port to a wild, chaotic boomtown. Streets were lined with tents, gambling halls, and hastily thrown together wooden shacks. The sound of hammers and pickaxes filled the air, competing with music, shouting, and gunfire. There were no banks, no law, no plumbing, just gold fever and the insanity that came with it. They called themselves the 49ers. Most arrived poor, sunburned, and covered in dust. They carried little more than blind hope and crude tools. Few had mining experience. Even fewer would strike it rich. But the dream was powerful enough to erase the odds. One man might dig for months and find nothing. Another could stumble upon a sparkling nugget the size of a walnut, and suddenly be rich beyond imagination, at least until he lost it all in a drunken poker game. And still they came. Every wagon that creaked westward carried more than tools. It carried ambition, desperation, and a fierce belief in reinvention. That out here, past the edge of everything, a man could become something new. 1849 wasn't just a year, it was a breaking point, and it reshaped not only California, but the very idea of America, a nation now obsessed with movement, with fortune, and with the myth that the next shovel full of dirt might change everything. When the gold came, the towns followed almost overnight. A miner struck it rich near a stream. Word got out, and suddenly hundreds of tents popped up like mushrooms after a storm. Within weeks, the tents turned to timber shacks. A saloon opened, then two, then 10. A blacksmith arrived, maybe a newspaper, a gambling hall. And just like that, a town was born. They called them boom towns because they didn't grow. They exploded. Places like Hangtown, Whiskey Town, and Rough and Ready weren't built on urban planning. They were built on adrenaline and blind hope. There were no mayors, no laws, no sidewalks, just mud, whiskey, and a whole lot of men with pickaxes and short tempers. By day, these men clawed at the hillsides and panned the icy rivers. By night, they drank, gambled, fought, and made terrible decisions in candle-lit saloons. Fortunes could be won with one lucky swing of a pick and lost in a single hand of poker. There were no rules, or rather there were too many made-ups on the spot, and enforced by whoever had the biggest gun or the loudest voice. Justice was improvised. Courtrooms were rare. Lynch mobs were not. But it wasn't just lawlessness. It was lonely, too. The population was overwhelmingly male. For every woman, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds of men. Letters from the East spoke of homesickness, heartbreak, and men crying quietly by campfires. The gold wasn't always in the ground. Sometimes it was just a memory of what they left behind. Some towns flourished for a time, San Francisco transformed from a sleepy harbor to a rowdy, bustling gateway to the goldfields. But many others didn't last. When the gold dried up, the people vanished. What was once a buzzing boomtown became a ghost town. Buildings left to rot, saloons still stocked with broken glasses, wind whispering through empty jail cells. The gold rush didn't just create towns, it devoured them. For every success story, there were hundreds of shattered dreams buried beneath muddy floors and abandoned tools. But no one came expecting guarantees. They came for chance, and boom towns, chaotic, filthy, and burning with hope, were where that chance lived for a little while. Gold fever sounds romantic until you're knee-deep in freezing river water, swinging a pickaxe into rock, sleeping on dirt, and calling beans your only friend. The life of a prospector wasn't glamorous. It was hard, lonely, and often miserable. But still, they came because the promise of riches, even the slimmest chance of it, made men do impossible things. Most arrived with little more than hope and a few essentials. A pickaxe, a shovel, a gold pan, and maybe a tin plate or two. If you had money, you might splurge on a rocker box, a wooden contraption that lets you sift through more dirt at once. If you really had cash, a long time sluice. If not, it was all down to your two hands and gravity. And patience. Panning for gold meant hours bent over a river, swirling sediment, hoping to catch a flicker of yellow among the rocks. Some struck it rich in a day. Most didn't. They dug holes, moved boulders, built flumes, dammed creeks, and chased every rumor of easy gold like moths to flame. They slept in tents if they were lucky, open skies if they weren't. Rain meant wet clothes. Snow meant frozen boots. Bears were a risk. So were thieves. Disease was constant. Dysentery, scurvy, cholera. Because sanitation was non-existent and miners weren't exactly washing their hands before meals. Food was basic and expensive. Eggs could cost more than a day's wages. Beans, bacon, and coffee made up the holy trinity of miner cuisine. Vegetables were bathing, optional. Haircuts, forget it. And still they stayed because the gold was real. People had found it. And if they could, maybe you could too. That was the sickness of it. Every backbreaking failure still carried the hope that the next shovel of dirt might change everything. So they dug day after day, year after year. Some never found more than dust. Others found enough to change their lives, or at least buy one hot bath and a better pair of boots. But success wasn't the only test. Tenacity was, and in the muddy chaos of the gold fields. That was sometimes the only thing separating the legends from the lost. Gold didn't just come out of the earth. It came with a price tag written in blood, sweat, and broken promises. For all the stories of overnight fortunes, the truth was far grittier. Most miners didn't get rich. Some found just enough to survive. Many left poorer than they arrived, carrying nothing home but blisters and regret. But the cost wasn't just personal. It was national. California was never empty, though the gold rush mythology would have you believe otherwise. Long before the miners came, the land was home to hundreds of thousands of Native Americans living across dozens of nations and tribes. But once gold was discovered, they were treated as little more than an obstacle between ambition and profit. As miners poured in, native lands were seized, poisoned, and burned. Rivers once full of salmon were clogged with debris and mercury. Forests were cut down, wildlife vanished, and the people. They were pushed out, hunted, enslaved, killed. The California state government even funded militias to clear the land, paying bounties for native scalps. By 1870, California's native population had plummeted by over 80%. What began as a rush for gold became a quiet genocide. But native tribes weren't the only ones who paid. Mexican and Chilean miners, who'd been working California's hills long before 1849, were soon targeted by racist laws and mobs. Chinese immigrants, who arrived in waves hoping to earn a better life, were taxed heavily and driven out of claims by violence. Black miners, both free and enslaved, faced legal and physical threats every step of the way. Even white miners fought among themselves. Claims were stolen, camps erupted in gunfire, fortune created friction, and everyone believed they deserved the prize. Gold brought chaos. It twisted morals. It rewrote values. Men who once believed in family, law, and church found themselves bribing, lying, stealing, sometimes killing, all for a glint in a pan. Because once you saw gold, really saw it, your soul never quite looked the same again. The gold rush wasn't just an event. It was a fever, a transformation. And for every ounce pulled from the ground, something else was buried deeper. Justice, peace, community, or conscience. Gold may have glinted in the rivers, but justice was a little harder to find. In the early days of the California gold rush, there were no real laws. California wasn't even a state yet. It was lawless, rapidly changing frontier, where a man's wealth or the size of his revolver often decided right from wrong. And so the miners made up their own rules. They formed what were called mining codes, loose agreements about claim sizes, boundaries, and behavior. If someone broke the rules, they were brought before a jury of their muddy, exhausted peers. But fairness was relative. He stole my shovel. Might get you a warning. He found a nugget on my land. Might get you hanged. Yes, hanged. Vigilante justice became the norm. There weren't enough sheriffs, so towns formed vigilance committees. These were self-appointed enforcers, quick to punish and rarely interested in trials. Suspects could be whipped, run out of town, or tied to a tree with a rope around their neck, often without evidence in saloons. They weren't just places to drink. They were courtrooms, gambling halls, and sometimes execution grounds. A drunken insult could escalate into a shootout. A lost card game might end in murder. Gun smoke and lawlessness danced side by side beneath swinging lanterns. Theft was rampant. Claim jumping, when someone tried to take over another man's land, could spark all-out war between rival camps. Property lines were often decided with fists, bullets, or hastily scribbled signs nailed to trees. But amidst the chaos, something strange happened. Communities began to emerge. Makeshift governments formed. Real sheriffs were elected. Towns started building courthouses instead of gallows. California drafted a constitution in 1849, even before it officially became a state in 1850. The Wild West began to tame itself slowly, violently, unevenly. But the scars of that early lawlessness never quite healed, because in the goldfields, justice had always been improvised. And even when the rules arrived, they came too late for many, buried beneath the hills, forgotten in dry creek beds, or swinging from tree branches that once doubled as judges. The California Gold Rush wasn't just an American story. It was a worldwide alarm bell, and it rang loud by 1850. Ships from every continent were docking in San Francisco Bay, their sails heavy with wind, their decks heavy with dreamers. Gold fever had gone global, and California wasn't just a place, it was an idea. They came from Chile, seasoned miners who had worked South America's gold fields long before the discovery at Sutter's Mill. They came from Peru, Mexico, and the West Indies, bringing skills, spices, and music from China. Thousands crossed the Pacific in wooden boats, driven by famine, poverty, and the promise of Gold Mountain. Europe sent its share to Irish, Germans, Italians, and Frenchmen, many escaping revolution, poverty, or war. Even a handful of Australians showed up, having chased their own gold and figured they'd try again on another continent. California became a swirling, churning, multilingual chaos, tents pitched side by side, arguments shouted in a dozen dialects, cooking fires, filling the hills with scents from 5 different continents. At first it seemed like something beautiful, a global gathering, all drawn by the same dream. But dreams have borders, and when gold was scarce, prejudice grew fast. Foreign miners were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Their success was resented, their accents mocked. Laws like the foreign miners' tax were introduced, targeting non-American miners with steep fees and harassment. Chinese miners were especially vulnerable. They were driven from claims, beaten, sometimes killed, while officials looked the other way. Spanish-speaking miners, even those born in California, faced legal discrimination and mob violence. Racism wasn't just casual, it was policy. Still, many stayed. They built communities, temples, churches, and businesses. San Francisco's Chinatown took root. Latino towns thrived along old Spanish land grants, and even as they were pushed to the margins, these global pioneers helped shape the future of California in its food, its language, its spirit. The gold rush didn't just bring people west, it brought the world west, and for better or worse. It showed what happened when cultures collided not over ideals, but over gold. Gold has a way of running out, even when the fever doesn't. By the mid-1850s, the rivers were quieter. The easy gold, the glittering flakes and nuggets that can be scooped from shallow stream beds, was gone. What remained was deeper, harder to reach, and required tools that most miners couldn't afford. The rush was over. Those who came expecting instant wealth now faced a cruel truth. The gold rush had never been a promise, only a gamble. And for most, the house had won. Some stayed, switching from panning to wage labor in large mining operations. These industrial outfits use hydraulic mining, massive jets of water blasting entire hillsides apart to extract the precious metal. It was faster, more efficient, and devastating. Landscapes were shredded, rivers clogged with debris and mercury. Farmland downstream was ruined. The gold might have still been flowing, but it came at a terrible cost, and lawsuits would eventually bring hydraulic mining to a halt decades later. Meanwhile, many of the original 49ers packed up and left, broken by exhaustion, illness, or simple disappointment. Some returned home, pockets empty. Others drifted into new frontiers, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, chasing the next rumor, the next miracle, and a few stayed. They became shopkeepers, ranchers, teachers, and mayors. They built California, not with shovels, but with roots. Because while the gold was drying up, something else had taken hold. Possibility. California had transformed. It was no longer a forgotten territory. It had roads, ports, towns, newspapers, banks, and finally statehood. In 1850, just 2 years after Marshall's discovery, California officially joined the Union. The gold rush was over, but its impact was irreversible. It had redrawn the map. It had filled the West with people, ambition, and violence. It had shattered indigenous populations, transformed the economy, and turned a sleepy frontier into a symbol of American reinvention. What began with a sparkle in a river ended with an empire in motion. And while the miners moved on, California stayed gold not just in its hills, but in its legend. Because sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you dig up, it's what you build after the digging ends. The gold rush ended, but its echo never stopped, even today. Nearly 2 centuries later, California still wears the gold rush like a second skin. Its nickname, the Golden State. Its motto, Eureka, I've found it. It's not subtle. This wasn't just a historical event. It became a national identity, a cultural myth baked into America's DNA. Because the gold rush wasn't just about gold, it was about reinvention. It taught a young, hungry nation that fortune wasn't inherited. It could be chased, dug, fought for, that you didn't need a noble name, just a shovel and a little madness. It was the beginning of the American dream as we now know it. Move fast, take risks, stake your claim. But the legacy is complicated. Yes, it brought rapid growth, innovation, and the birth of the modern West. It gave rise to San Francisco, to the railroad, to California, as a cultural and economic giant. But it also left scars, deep ones. Native communities were nearly erased. Landscapes were ravaged. Racist laws created lasting wounds. Chinese laborers, Mexican miners, black pioneers, they built California too. But their stories were buried under the glittering myth of the white prospector with the lucky pan. And yet people still come. Not for gold, perhaps, but for something like it. For tech, for fame, for reinvention. Silicon Valley isn't far from Sutter's Mill. The tools have changed from pickaxes to code. But hunger, it's the same. That's the real legacy. The belief that somewhere just over the horizon, with enough guts and luck, everything can change. The gold rush wasn't just a rush for metal. It was a collision of cultures, of ambitions, of illusions. It revealed the best and worst of human nature in the span of a single decade, and it turned one accidental discovery into one of the most transformational chapters in American history. The gold is mostly gone now, but the dream it sparked is still digging. Helen Adams Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama, a place of green fields, cotton farms, and southern sun. Her parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, were thrilled. She was healthy, beautiful, and curious, with bright blue eyes and a soft, eager laugh. For the first 19 months of her life, Helen was just like any other child. She learned to crawl, to babble, to smile at her mother's face and chase shadows across the porch. She loved the family dog, the garden, and the wind. Her world was full of sound and color, until suddenly it wasn't. In February 1882, Helen was struck by a mysterious illness. Some said scarlet fever. Others believed it was meningitis. Doctors didn't know. All anyone could do was wait. For days, she burned with fever. Her body trembled. Her mother hovered, terrified. And then it broke. The fever passed. Helen survived. But the cost was staggering. She could no longer see, no longer hear. The world had turned dark and silent, as if the illness had slammed a door shut, sealing her inside her own body. She was not yet 2 years old. At first, her family hoped it was temporary. Maybe she was just recovering slowly. Maybe her eyes would adjust. Maybe she'd respond to a sound, a voice, a bell, dog's bark. But time passed, and it became clear. Helen had been cut off from the senses that connect us to the world. Now imagine this. A toddler filled with energy and intelligence, suddenly unable to understand the faces smiling at her, the arms reaching for her, the voices calling her name. She had no language, no symbols, no way to express what she wanted or what she feared. Frustration filled the silence. Rage followed. She learned to mimic actions, to open doors, to nod or shake her head, but not meaning. Her world was texture, vibration, smell, and inside her a storm brewed. By the age of 5, Helen Keller was described as a wild child, intelligent, strong-willed, and completely unmanageable. She would scream, kick, and even hit those around her, not out of cruelty, but desperation. She was locked inside her own mind, and no one knew how to reach her. Not yet. By the time Helen Keller was 5 years old, the cheerful toddler who once played in the garden had become something else entirely untamed. Imagine being locked in total darkness. No sound, no sight, no language. Just raw sensation and confusion. For Helen, life had become a blur of textures and instincts. She had no words to express hunger or fear, no way to understand comfort or discipline. So she lashed out. She threw tantrums, kicked furniture, ripped buttons off clothes, and slapped her baby sister out of jealousy. Her meals became battlegrounds. She ate with her hands, grabbed food from others' plates, and screamed when anyone tried to correct her. Her moods could swing from laughter to rage without warning. The Kellers didn't know what to do. Their daughter was intelligent. That much was obvious. She had figured out routines, learned how to open doors, unlock cabinets, even mimic household tasks. But her intelligence made her defiance more dangerous. Her parents were exhausted. Relatives whispered that she belonged in an asylum. Her mother, Kate, refused to give up. She began writing letters, searching for help, not just from doctors, but from anyone who might know how to reach a child like Helen. The trail led them to Alexander Graham Bell, who, aside from inventing the telephone, was also deeply involved in education for the deaf. Bell didn't have the solution, but he had a suggestion. He pointed them toward a school in Boston, the Perkins Institute for the Blind. And at that school, a young woman was recommended to travel south and meet the Kellers. Her name wasn't Sullivan. She was just 20 years old, visually impaired herself, poor, fiercely determined, and completely unprepared for the storm she was about to walk into. When it arrived in Alabama in March 1887, she was greeted by a bright, beautiful child. Uncombed hair, wild eyes, a mischievous grin, and a scream that could shatter windows. Helen Keller wasn't cruel. She was trapped. The world had shut its doors, and she was pounding on them with everything she had. And Sullivan had one job: opened the door, and nothing, not rage, not silence, not blindness, was going to stop her from trying. March 1887, Tuscumbia, Alabama. A young woman named Sullivan had arrived, determined to teach the unteachable. She moved into a small cottage on the Keller property, taking Helen away from the main house. Away from indulgence, distraction, and pity, his method was radical structure, discipline, and above all, language. But how do you teach language to a child who doesn't hear words or see letters? And began by spelling them into Helen's hand, one letter at a time, using the manual alphabet used by the deaf doll. She would sign into Helen's palm as she handed her doll. Helen copied the movements. She was smart, curious, but to her it was just finger play, motions with no meaning. She could mimic 100 signs and still not grasp that things had names, and was relentless. She spelled the names of everything Helen touched. Cake, mug, spoon, water, bread, key. But the child didn't connect them. There was no concept yet, no understanding that the shapes in her palm represented the world around her. Then came April 5th, 1887, a day edged into history, and took Helen to the water pump outside. In one hand, she placed Helen's fingers under the flow of cool water. With the other, she spelled into her palm water again and again, water splashing, fingers moving. Water. Suddenly, Helen froze. The chaos inside her calmed. Her face lit up with wonder. She dropped the mug. She touched the ground and spelled earth. She touched the pump and spelled pump. She touched his dress, her face, her own hand. She had gotten it. For the first time in her life, Helen Keller understood that everything had a name and that words could be touched, felt. Learned that single moment shattered the walls that had imprisoned her since infancy. The door had opened, and Helen, once locked in silent darkness, had found her way through. By nightfall, she had learned 30 words. She would go on to learn thousands. But that was the moment the silence broke, and the world for the first time had meaning. Once Helen understood that words had meaning, there was no going back. The door had opened, and now she wanted to run through it. Her mind, starved for years, devoured everything and offered. Nouns, verbs, adjectives. She wanted to name the entire world. Every object, every sensation, every emotion. Nothing was too small, too abstract, too complex, and could barely keep up. She taught Helen using real-world experience. They walked through gardens, touched flowers, leaves, bark, and soil. Helen learned the word flower by feeling a rose tree, by hugging its trunk storm, by standing in the rain. And she didn't just want to know what things were, she wanted to know why they were. She asked deep philosophical questions. What is love? Where does the sun go at night? Why do people cry? This wasn't memorization. It was an awakening. She also began to understand manners and morality. Not just yes and no, but right and wrong. And spelled stories into her hand. Biblical parables, Aesop's fables, poems, fairy tales. Through these, Helen learned about kindness, selfishness, generosity, and justice. Language wasn't just power, it was freedom. Helen even began writing her first simple sentences, using a special slate with raised lines. Each word she spelled made her feel more human, more seen. The frustration that had once driven her to scream and break things had transformed into purpose. But none of this happened by accident. And Sullivan worked tirelessly, often 16 hours a day, to unlock Helen's potential. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a translator, mentor, protector, best friend. The bond between them was deeper than family, closer than blood, and had once called herself half-blind and unwanted. Now she was shaping one of the most remarkable minds in history, and the world began to notice. Newspapers started publishing stories about the miracle child in Alabama, the deaf-blind girl who was now reading, writing, learning faster than anyone believed possible. Helen's hunger wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was just getting started, because now that she had a voice, even if it came through fingers, she wanted to speak to everyone. And one day, soon she would. By the age of 10, Helen Keller had already defied expectations. She could read Braille, write full sentences, and communicate rapidly through fingerspelling. She devoured books, memorized poems, and debated complex ideas with her teacher, but it wasn't enough. Helen didn't just want to communicate. She wanted to speak. The idea seemed absurd. She was both deaf and blind. How could she possibly learn to form words she had never heard, shaped by sound she had never experienced? But Helen wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for instruction. So in 1890, her family sent her to the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston. There she met Sarah Fuller, a dedicated speech teacher who agreed to try the impossible. The method was tactile. Helen placed her fingers on Sarah's lips, cheeks, and throat as she spoke. She felt the vibration of sounds, the shape of the mouth, the movement of the tongue. Then, slowly, painfully, she began to mimic them. Letter by letter, word by word, she practiced endlessly, forming syllables in front of mirrors, feeling her own face, repeating each sound dozens of times. Her first word was it. Next comes small steps, giant courage. It wasn't easy. Her voice was difficult to understand at first. Even those closest to her struggled to make out her words. But Helen kept going because to her, speech was freedom on another level, a bridge to the world she had never truly entered, and every day her pronunciation improved, and was by her side through every attempt, encouraging, correcting, celebrating. Together, they turned what seemed like a miracle into a method. By 12, Helen could speak full sentences with time. She would learn to give speeches, recite poetry, even engage in lively conversation, though most people still needed an interpreter to understand her clearly. But that didn't matter, because Helen Keller had done what even optimists thought impossible. She gave a sound of silence. She had no memory of hearing her own voice, and yet she had created one. With breath, muscle, and pure defiance, she had found her voice, and she would spend the rest of her life using it. By her mid-teens, Helen Keller had already achieved more than most people expected in a lifetime. But she wasn't content with being a miracle. She wanted to be educated, truly, formally, completely. So she set her sights on something no deaf-blind person had ever attempted: college. The decision stunned people. Some admired it, others mocked it. But Helen didn't care. She enrolled at the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a prep school for women aspiring to attend Radcliffe College, a sister school to Harvard. It was grueling, and Sullivan attended every class with her, spelling entire lectures into Helen's hand, letter by letter, hour after hour. Imagine taking notes when you can't see the blackboard, can't hear the professor, and must absorb every word through touch. Every textbook had to be transcribed into Braille. Every test dictated word by painstaking word. Helen studied Latin, French, algebra, geometry, philosophy, history, literature. Her days were long, her nights even longer. She often went to bed with sore hands and a spinning mind. There were moments of pure frustration, tears, exhaustion, even doubt. But she never gave up. She was accepted into Radcliffe College in 1900. Suddenly, she wasn't just a student. She was a symbol. Newspapers followed her story. Photographers tried to capture her studying, reading, writing. People wanted to see the blind girl with a mind. But Helen didn't want to be a spectacle. She wanted to learn, not as a novelty, but as an equal. At Radcliffe, she continued her intense studies, even as administrators remained skeptical. Some professors doubted her intelligence. Others found in Sullivan's constant presence distracting. But Helen pressed on, proving her intellect over and over. In 1904, at age 24, Helen Keller graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College, the first deaf-blind person in the world to earn a college degree. She had taken on academia without sight or sound and won. But it wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a public declaration. That disability did not mean inability. That the human spirit, given a chance, could outshine every limitation. Helen was just getting started. Now educated, articulate, and ready to change the world, she turned toward a new battlefield activism. Helen Keller could not hear a crowd cheer or see her name in print, but she could feel injustice, and she refused to be silent about it with her education complete. Helen stepped into a new role, not as a student, but as a fighter, a voice for the unheard, a symbol for those the world ignored. She became a fierce advocate for the blind and the deaf, but she didn't stop there. Helen took on poverty, women's suffrage, racism, child labor, and workers' rights. She criticized powerful corporations, supported birth control, even spoke out against war. People expected a quiet, delicate woman. What they got was a political firestorm. She joined the Socialist Party in 1909, arguing that capitalism was crushing the poor while the rich prospered. This shocked many of her admirers, people who were comfortable applauding her triumph over disability, but weren't ready for her to challenge their bank accounts. When someone accused her of being misled, she replied, "It is true that I am blind and deaf, but I am not blind to social injustice, nor deaf to the cries of the suffering." She gave lectures around the country, sometimes with and Sullivan beside her, interpreting her words. She met world leaders, presidents, authors, and revolutionaries. She was blunt, brilliant, and impossible to dismiss. She campaigned for the American Foundation for the Blind, helping to raise awareness and funding across the nation. She testified before Congress, lobbied for Braille books in libraries, and championed equal education for the disabled. And she wrote books, essays, columns, letters. Her pen was a sword, and she wielded it without fear. In the public eye, she was a paradox, a woman who couldn't see or hear, but who saw more clearly than most, and who spoke more powerfully than those with perfect voices. She demanded dignity, not just for herself, but for the marginalized, the voiceless, the forgotten. And though many disagreed with her politics, no one could ignore her presence. Helen Keller had once lived in a world without words. Now her words were changing the world. As Helen Keller grew older, the world grew louder in its admiration. She had become a global icon, a symbol of courage, intellect, and boundless will. From Tokyo to Cairo, from Washington to Moscow, her name meant something powerful. Hope. She traveled the world over 35 countries, advocating for the blind and the disabled. Crowds gathered just to see her walk onto a stage. Heads of state bent to shake her hand. Children reached for her, eyes wide as if touching her might pass on some of her fire. And yet, behind the applause, there was always shadow. And Sullivan, her companion, teacher, and best friend, began to lose her health in the 1920s. For decades, they had been inseparable, two souls fused by struggle and love. But in 1936, passed away. Helen was devastated. She had known darkness. She had known silence. But this, the silence left by Anne's absence, was different. It was deeper, and still she continued. She found support in Polly Thompson, who became her new interpreter and companion. Together, they continued the mission. Public speaking, fundraising, lobbying, writing. Helen didn't slow down, not even in her 70s. In 1948, she toured Japan after World War II, meeting wounded soldiers, children in ruined schools, and people who had lost everything. Her presence gave them more than comfort. It gave them a glimpse of what survival looked like when everything else had failed. She received dozens of honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of America's highest civilian awards. Universities gave her honorary degrees. Foundations were named in her honor. Books and films told her story. But Helen didn't care for trophies. She cared that blind children had books, that deaf adults had jobs, that people who once felt invisible now I felt seen. Even as her own health declined in her final years, she continued to write letters, dictate messages, and support causes she believed in. She once said, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of overcoming it." She had lived both sides of that sentence, and through it all, she remained fully, fiercely herself on June 1st, 1968. At the age of 87, Helen Keller passed away in her sleep. She died peacefully in her home in Connecticut, a woman once locked in silence and darkness, now mourned across the world by presidents, poets, activists, and everyday people who had never even met her. But death could not silence her. Helen had become more than a person. She had become a force, a symbol of what the human spirit could do when handed the worst and still daring to rise. Born into a world that offered her nothing, No sight, no sound, no voice. She created a life that left nothing untouched. She helped rewrite how people view disability. She shattered the idea that blindness meant helplessness or that deafness meant ignorance. She proved that communication isn't limited to ears or eyes. It comes from the soul. She wrote 14 books, gave hundreds of speeches, and met every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. She changed laws. She changed institutions. But most of all, she changed minds. Her life wasn't easy, and she never pretended otherwise. She faced illness, rejection, grief, and public criticism, but she never let those things define her. Instead, she defined herself loudly. She once said, "I'm only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something." And what she did was reshape history. Today, schools bear her name. Statues stand in her honor. Her books are still read. Her quotes still pass between people in need of strength. And in moments when life feels too heavy, when silence seems too loud, when darkness seems to stretch endlessly, her legacy reminds us there is always a way through. You may not see it, you may not hear it, but you can be it. Helen Keller never saw a sunrise. She never heard applause, but she taught the world how to listen. And that's a voice that never fades. Long before runways and designer tags, fashion began where civilization did. With sunlight, sand, and the struggle to survive, in ancient Egypt, fashion wasn't just practical, it was sacred. With the Nile as their mirror and the desert as their backdrop, Egyptians draped themselves in linen, light, breathable, and born from the flax that grew along the riverbanks. But it wasn't just about beating the heat. Clothes were spiritual, symbolic. Pharaohs wore finely pleated kilts, golden pectorals, and intricate collars encrusted with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. Every color meant something. White for purity, green for fertility, blue for the gods. The more detailed the weave, the more divine your status. Even children went unclothed until puberty, their innocence worn openly, while the elite were wrapped like living statues, their garments reflecting order and cosmic balance across the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. Fashion served a similar dual purpose, protection and prestige. Men wore woolen skirts tied with belts. Women wore layered robes and veils, the earliest legal code to mention clothing. The Code of Hammurabi actually dictated who could wear what. Veils reserved for noble women. Slaves were forbidden to wear them. Ancient India brought color into the conversation. With hand-spun cotton and early silk, people wore saris, dhotis, and turbans dyed with plant-based pigments like indigo and madder root. Their textiles told stories of region, of ritual, of rhythm. The Indus Valley might not have left us volumes of written history, but its tiny terracotta figurines show hairstyles, jewelry, and textiles that speak across time. And then there was China, where silk wasn't just a fabric. It was a revolution, legend says. Empress Leizu discovered it when a silkworm cocoon dropped into her tea. By the time of the Shang dynasty, silk became a state secret, protected as fiercely as gold. Who wore silk? The elite, the rulers, heaven's favorites. Even this early fashion was never random. It separated kings from servants, priests from commoners, men from women, and sometimes mortals from gods. The shape of a robe, the twist of a belt, the color of a thread. Fashion was language before writing, art before galleries, and long before anyone said, "Look at me," clothes already had the world's attention. In the marble halls of Athens and on the crowded streets of Rome, fashion became philosophy and a uniform of identity. The ancient Greeks favored balance in all things. In architecture, in thought, and in the folds of their garments, men wore chitons, rectangular linen garments pinned at the shoulder and belted at the waist. Women draped themselves in peploi or Hermetian cloaks, graceful folds of fabric that transformed the body into a living sculpture. Sandals were simple, hair was styled with restraint, and jewelry, though present, was always in service to harmony to the Greeks. Beauty was moral. Simplicity meant virtue. Ornamentation was fine, as long as it didn't shout. But then came Rome, and Rome never whispered. Roman fashion was about spectacle, power, class. Where the Greeks draped, the Romans layered and legislated. The toga, made from a single piece of wool up to 20 feet long, became the ultimate Roman status symbol. Not everyone could wear one. Only male Roman citizens. And even then, there were rules. There was the toga virilis for adult men, the toga praetexta with a purple stripe for senators and magistrates, and the toga picta, embroidered with gold and reserved for emperors and victorious generals. Each type was a costume of authority. Beneath the togas, everyone wore tunics, the t-shirt of the ancient world. Simple, knee-length for men, ankle-length for women, but even tunics told stories. A wealthy Roman might wear a tunic woven from Egyptian linen or dyed with rare murex purple, a color so expensive it was worth more than gold. Women's fashion in Rome was equally coded. The stola marked a married woman. The pallor, a cloak-like shawl, offered modesty and movement. Hair was curled, braided, piled high, and sometimes adorned with gold or ivory pins. Fashion wasn't just about beauty. It was a message of fertility, virtue, and social belonging. Even slaves had a fashion role, defined by what they couldn't wear. In both Greece and Rome, clothing didn't just protect the body. It displayed your rank, your role, your citizenship. Every fold, every fabric, every color was a declaration. You didn't just wear a toga, you wore the state. While Rome wrapped itself in wool and Greece in linen, Asia was spinning something far more luxurious: silk. The Silk Road was more than a trade route. It was a fashion superhighway. Stretching from China to the Mediterranean, it carried not just goods, but ideas, fabrics, and styles that would shape centuries of dress. At the heart of it all was China, where silk wasn't just an export, it was a symbol of imperial control for centuries. The knowledge of silk production was guarded like a state secret. Only royalty and high-ranking officials were allowed to wear the most refined silks dyed in colors reserved for emperors, like the brilliant near-mythical imperial yellow. Chinese robes, especially under the Tang and Han dynasties, were masterpieces of structure and symbolism. Embroidered dragons, phoenixes, and clouds weren't just decoration. They were spiritual markers of rank and destiny. A person's robe said more than a scroll ever could. Further west in India, fashion took a different turn. Bold, colorful, and sensually draped. The sari, still worn today, dates back thousands of years. Woven from fine cotton and silk, dyed with indigo and turmeric, saris weren't just beautiful. They were regional fingerprints. A woman's fold, fabric, and border could reveal where she was from, her caste, her status. Meanwhile, in Japan, elegance met armor. During the Heian period, nobles wore layered silk robes called junihito, their sleeves and collars revealing carefully coordinated colors, a kind of poetic fashion code. But as the samurai class rose, fashion turned toward function and symbolism. Enter the kimono. Worn by both warriors and commoners, the kimono became a garment of layered meaning, its fabric, weave, and design communicating season, occasion, and even political loyalty. The samurai's kimono was sometimes worn beneath armor, its crest boldly announcing clan allegiance. For geisha and courtiers, kimono sleeves became canvases for art. Asian fashion balanced tradition with refinement, restraint with richness. Every pleat, pattern, and stitch was deliberate, and as fabrics flowed along the Silk Road, Asia quietly taught the world something vital: that clothing wasn't just about protection or pride, it was culture sewn into skin. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, clothing was not just what you wore, it was who you were. From castle halls to candlelit courts, fashion became a chessboard where every thread was a move and every outfit a declaration of power, virtue, or rebellion. During the Middle Ages, clothing was rigidly tied to class. The poor wore coarse wool and undyed linen. The rich, they turned themselves into walking tapestries. Fur-lined cloaks, jewel-studded belts, and elaborate brocades signaled wealth and piety in equal measure. Dyes were everything. A deep blue meant wealth. A true scarlet reserved for royalty and cardinals. And then came sumptuary laws, literal legal codes that dictated what you could or could not wear based on your social rank. If you dared to wear silk without noble blood, that wasn't a fashion crime. It was an actual crime. In Renaissance Italy, fashion became an art form. Florence and Venice led the way, creating garments so opulent they seemed to defy gravity. Men wore puffed sleeves and slashed doublets. Women donned velvet gowns with rigid bodices and embroidered sleeves that whispered stories of family lineage and political power. It was no coincidence that during this time of intellectual rebirth, fashion became intensely theatrical. The more fabric you wore, the less you were expected to work. It was a silent performance of status. Look how much I can afford to waste. Then came the corset, originally worn for posture and modesty. It evolved into a tool of silhouette control, cinching waists, lifting busts, and eventually becoming a symbol of both feminine elegance and restraint. The ideal woman's body became an architectural achievement, and in the grand courts of France and England, fashion reached dizzying new heights. Literally, with towering wigs, ruffled collars, and dresses that required scaffolding underneath, women moved like chandeliers. And men were just as dramatic, with tights, jewels, codpieces, and shoes that curled like punctuation marks. Fashion was power. A courtier's gown could curry favor or ruin reputations. To be seen was everything. To be seen incorrectly, dangerous. In a world of crowns and conspiracies, clothing was armor, not just against the cold, but against irrelevance. By the 17th century, European fashion had become a spectacle of excess. At the French court of Louis XIV, fashion wasn't just a pastime, it was policy. Versailles was a stage and everyone wore a costume. Men strutted in brocade coats with gold embroidery, lace cuffs, silk stockings, and red-heeled shoes, a signature of the king himself. Their hair powdered, perfumed and piled into towering wigs, often adorned with curls, ribbons, and even miniature ships. Women's dresses were architectural wonders. Wide panniers stretched skirts out several feet on each side. Gowns were layered, ruffled, and embroidered within an inch of collapse. The skin was powdered white, cheeks painted red, and beauty spots placed like exclamation points. It was beautiful, ridiculous, and deeply political. In a world where wealth meant control, fashion became a language of elite detachment. To the nobility, clothing was a way to rise above the ordinary. To everyone else, it was a reminder of just how far they had fallen. And then came the French Revolution. In 1789, the people stormed Versailles. Not just the palace, but everything it represented. Excess inequality, silk and satin at the expense of bread. The guillotine didn't just fall on kings. It fell on wigs, heels, corsets. The fashion of the upper class became the uniform of the enemy. Suddenly, simplicity was power. The sans-culottes, or without breeches, proudly rejected aristocratic knee-length trousers. Instead, they wore plain trousers, the clothing of the working class. To wear extravagant clothes during this time wasn't just tone deaf, it was dangerous. In the wake of revolution, fashion itself became democratic. The classical world was idolized. Clean lines, natural fabrics, Greek-inspired gowns, wigs, and heavy makeup vanished almost overnight. Even Napoleon understood clothing as strategy. His military uniform, designed for drama and authority, helped create the image of the strong modern leader. His wife, Josephine, popularized high-waisted gowns and sheer fabrics that redefined elegance for the Empire era. But the powdered wig had become a relic. Fashion had shifted from flaunting wealth to redefining identity. The revolution didn't just change who ruled France, it changed what people wore to survive it. The 19th century roared in on the hiss of steam engines and the hum of textile looms. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked, it changed how people dressed. Suddenly, clothing wasn't reserved for aristocrats and royalty. Machines could spin, dye, and stitch fabric faster than human hands ever could. Mass production meant lower prices, more availability, and for the first time in history, fashion began to trickle down. But even as manufacturing modernized, style remained rooted in spectacle. Women's fashion took on volume, dramatic, sweeping, and almost absurd. The invention of the crinoline, a cage-like steel frame worn beneath skirts, allowed women to wear dresses that ballooned outward like open umbrellas. Some reached 6 feet in diameter, forcing women to move sideways through doors and practically orbit in ballroom circles. The message was clear. If you could wear a dress that prevented work, walking, or even sitting comfortably, you were probably wealthy enough not to care. Meanwhile, corsets tightened even further, shaping waists into wasp-like proportions. The ideal woman became a fragile hourglass, floating on a sea of silk, lace, and tulle. Fashion was both a prison and a pedestal. For men, fashion settled into sharp, sober lines, tailcoats, waistcoats, top hats, the uniform of the respectable gentleman. It was during this time that the modern suit began to take form. Clean, restrained, professional, dignified without being flashy. But beneath the surface, new trends were stirring. Department stores sprang up in cities, offering ready-made clothes to a growing middle class. Fashion magazines like Godey's Ladies' Book and La Belle Assemble began shaping tastes, and with photography emerging, people could now see what fashion looked like far beyond their village. The rise of the sewing machine in the 1850s brought yet another shift, not just in production, but in personal creativity. Home sewing patterns became popular. Style became accessible. Fashion was no longer just for the elite. It was becoming a tool for expression. Even Queen Victoria had an impact, popularizing white wedding dresses, mourning black, and modesty as fashion. In this new industrial world, clothes no longer just reflected identity. They were now building it one stitch at a time. As the 20th century dawned, fashion stood at a crossroads, torn between the corseted elegance of the past and the liberation roaring in with the future. Then came World War I, and everything changed. With men off to battle, women stepped into factories, fields, and offices. The corset, once a daily ritual, became impractical, even dangerous. Skirts shortened, fabrics lightened. Practicality became patriotic. Women in uniforms, trousers, and simple tailored coats began to rewrite the definition of femininity. After the war, they weren't ready to go back. The 1920s ushered in a new archetype, the flapper. She wore drop-waist dresses, bobbed her hair, painted her lips red, and danced in speakeasies with a cigarette holder in one hand and rebellion in the other. Her dresses shimmered with fringe and beads, her knees scandalized society, and her confidence defied generations of restraint. This was fashion as freedom, as refusal. Meanwhile, the men of the Jazz Age embraced sharp suits, wide-legged trousers, slick-back hair, and Oxford shoes. Hollywood helped glamorize this image on screen and off. Stars like Greta Garbo and Clark Gable set trends that audiences across the world followed. Then came the crash. The Great Depression of the 1930s forced fashion back toward conservatism. Hemlines dropped, colors dulled, people mended instead of buying. Style didn't disappear, it adapted. Old garments were reworked, flour sacks turned into dresses, and movie stars became style icons of hope amid economic despair. When World War II struck, fashion became a battlefield of its own. Materials were rationed. Skirts became shorter, jackets boxier, fabrics stiffer in the U.S. The government issued L-85 regulations dictating how much cloth could be used in civilian clothing. Nylon, once used for stockings, was redirected for parachutes. Women in Europe wore utility clothing, efficient, minimalist, and often uniform-like. Men returned to service dress and battle dress. Yet out of these limits came innovation. Women wore slacks more frequently. Shoulder pads added structure. Fashion designers like Elsa Schiaparelli introduced surreal elements, thumbing their nose at austerity. In the face of global conflict, fashion became more than style. It became resilience, a signal to the world that even in chaos, we still choose who we are and what we wear to survive. The world emerged from World War II, battered but hungry for beauty, and in 1947, French designer Christian Dior gave it just that. He called it the new look: cinched waists, full sweeping skirts, soft shoulders, and delicate fabrics. It was a dramatic return to opulence, a celebration of femininity, luxury, and control. For many women, it felt like breathing again after years of rations and uniforms, but not everyone applauded. To some, the new look was a step backward, a return to restrictive ideals after decades of progress. The tension between tradition and transformation would define fashion for decades to come. In the 1950s, American suburbia embraced clean-cut style, pearls and pencil skirts, gray flannel suits, and everything ironed to perfection. But underneath the polished surface, rebellion was brewing. Teenagers, a newly defined demographic, began rejecting their parents' look. They idolized screen rebels like James Dean and Marlon Brando, whose plain white t-shirts, leather jackets, and blue jeans felt raw, honest, and dangerous. And there it was, denim. Once a symbol of the American working class, denim became a uniform of youth rebellion. It wasn't fashion made for you, it was fashion you claimed. Then came the 1960s, and the revolution wasn't just televised, it was worn. London's mod culture gave birth to slim suits, mini skirts, and bold prints. The hippies embraced embroidery, bell-bottoms, and secondhand chic. Fashion became political, anti-war, anti-establishment, anti-everything that came before. By the 1970s, the lines had blurred. Haute couture still thrived, but where it had found its voice. Music drove fashion from disco sequins to punk's torn shirts and safety pins, and through it all, jeans endured, dressed up, distressed, or ripped in protest. Designers like Yves Saint Laurent and Vivienne Westwood understood the shifting tide. Fashion was no longer dictated from the top down. It was now a two-way mirror, reflecting and shaping the world all at once. Clothes were no longer just about class or gender. They were about attitude, identity, resistance. From Dior's silks to Levi's denim, fashion had become something new entirely. Not just what you wore, but who you were. As the 20th century ended, fashion shed its final skin. It stopped asking, what should we wear? And started asking, who are we? The 21st century began with a new energy, one driven by identity, diversity, and the rise of the digital age. Fashion was no longer ruled by seasonal trends whispered in the halls of Paris and Milan. Now it pulsed through Instagram, TikTok, and street corners in Seoul, Nairobi, and New York. Trends were global and instant. A teenager with a smartphone could spark a movement faster than a runway ever could. The rise of fast fashion made style more accessible than ever before. Brands like Zara, H&M, and Forever 21 churned out catwalk-inspired clothes at lightning speed. But it came with a cost. Environmental damage, exploitative labor, and a growing awareness of fashion's dark side. In response, sustainability became a new standard. Designers started rethinking materials, waste, and responsibility. Thrift stores surged. Upcycling became cool. Capsule wardrobes and buy less, choose well became mantras. But the real revolution, it was a representation. For decades, fashion favored one body type, one skin tone, one ideal. But now the industry is changing. Designers are casting models of all races, sizes, genders, and abilities. Runways feature hijabs, wheelchairs, vitiligo, and drag. What once existed on the margins now walks center stage. Fashion became a battleground for cultural conversations. Think Black Lives Matter slogans on couture gowns, pride parades with high heels and glitter as protest armor. Indigenous designers reclaim traditional patterns as a statement of survival. Gender is no longer a cage. From androgynous tailoring to skirts on the men's racks, the binary boundaries of fashion began to blur. Icons like Billy Porter, Harry Styles, and Zendaya wore clothes not as statements, but as freedom. And in the metaverse, avatars strut in outfits that can't even exist in real life. Digital fashion, no fabric, no waste, just pixels and imagination, is becoming its own frontier. Fashion now lives everywhere, and it belongs to everyone. What began as linen in ancient Egypt has become a global language, one that can whisper tradition, scream rebellion, or simply say, "This is me." Because in the end, fashion isn't just what we wear, it's how we show the world who we are.